The origins of gladiatorial combat lie deep within the early traditions of the Etruscan civilization, where the boundary between life and death was viewed through a spiritual lens, and where ritualized violence carried profound meaning. For the Etruscans, death was not a mere cessation of existence, but a journey into a perilous realm that demanded preparation, sacrifice, and offerings of blood to ensure safe passage. Within this worldview, combat at funerals was not intended as entertainment in the sense that later Roman audiences would understand it. Instead, it was a sacred act of service to the deceased, an obligation that bound the living to the spirits of their ancestors. Funeral games, known as munera, carried the weight of religious duty. The very word signified a gift, a service performed in honor of another, rather than a spectacle staged for the enjoyment of the masses. When a prominent noble passed away, his family was expected to provide rituals worthy of his social rank. Among these rituals was the presentation of combat between captured warriors, criminals, or slaves whose spilled blood would act as a bridge between the world of the living and the afterlife. Each drop of blood was thought to contain vital essence, a force capable of nourishing the departed spirit and arming it with strength against the dangers of the underworld. These funeral combats varied in scale depending on the status of the deceased. A wealthy or politically significant noble might require multiple pairs of fighters, while a lesser aristocrat's funeral could be marked by a single brutal contest. The spectacle was staged close to the tomb or burial site so that the bloodshed occurred within sacred proximity to the deceased. In this way, combat itself became part of the burial ritual, binding the social prestige of the noble to the physical suffering of the combatants. This connection established one of the earliest patterns that would define gladiatorial traditions for centuries. The higher the rank of the person honored, the more elaborate and bloody the ceremonies that accompanied their death. The fighters themselves were rarely volunteers. They were drawn from the ranks of prisoners of war captured during Etruscan campaigns against neighboring tribes and city-states. Those deemed strong or skilled enough to provide a compelling fight were spared execution or slavery in favor of serving as sacrificial combatants. The selection process reflected both practicality and spectacle. It was not enough for the fighters to simply die. They were expected to put on a display of courage, struggle, and martial skill, even as they marched toward certain death. To ensure this, warriors were often chosen for their size, physical condition, and experience in battle, thereby creating contests that bore the marks of genuine combat rather than simple execution. Archaeological remains give vivid glimpses into these early spectacles. The painted tombs of Tarquinia depict scenes of combat that were integral to Etruscan funerary culture. One painting shows a hooded prisoner attacked by a dog, his captor standing nearby with leash in hand, a scene that blurs the line between combat and ritualized execution. Other frescoes present armed duels between warriors carrying round shields and short swords, their armor resembling the gear that would later inspire Roman gladiatorial equipment. The detailed observation in these paintings suggests that the artists had witnessed the events firsthand, capturing not fantasy but reality. Beyond paintings, excavations in places such as Volsi have yielded tangible artifacts that confirm the role of combat in funerary ceremonies. Helmets adorned with elaborate crests, short bronze swords, and shield fragments testify to a tradition where craftsmanship and ritual purpose converged. These weapons were often specially made for the occasion, not recycled from the battlefield, showing that families invested considerable resources in creating spectacles that honored the dead. To commission such equipment was not merely an act of devotion, but also a display of wealth and prestige, for the quality of the combat reflected directly on the reputation of the family. The religious dimension of these rituals cannot be overstated. Etruscan mythology populated the afterlife with hostile spirits and demonic figures who threatened to bar the soul from reaching its destination. Blood was believed to pacify these forces, to bribe or appease the guardians of the underworld. Among these deities was Aita, the Etruscan lord of the dead, who demanded offerings from the living. Demonic guides, terrifying in form, might either hinder or assist the soul, depending on whether they had been properly honored through sacrifice. In this sense, funeral combat was as much a negotiation with the unseen as it was a demonstration for the living. Priests known as haruspices oversaw the ceremonies, interpreting omens and determining the proper scale of the combat. They examined the entrails of sacrificial animals, reading divine will in the patterns of livers and hearts, and then declared how many fighters should bleed, what form the combat should take, and how it would serve the journey of the dead. Their presence ensured that the violence remained framed within ritual, even if onlookers also took grim satisfaction in watching the condemned clash. The balance between sacred duty and the growing fascination with bloodshed foreshadowed the transformation that would later occur in Roman society. The military culture of the Etruscans provided the foundation for these contests. Their armies wielded short, thrusting swords and oval or round shields, equipment that fighters brought into the funerary arena. Helmets with decorated crests protected heads while offering visual spectacle, a blend of practicality and symbolism. As the Etruscans fought and absorbed influences from surrounding peoples, their warriors adopted new tactics and weapons, which in turn appeared in funerary combat. From this merging of military tradition and ritual practice, the seed of gladiatorial combat was planted. These rituals carried implications far beyond the spiritual. They became markers of status, tools of competition among aristocratic families, eager to surpass one another in the splendor of their funeral games. To sponsor elaborate combats was to proclaim wealth, piety, and social dominance. This dynamic created a culture where violence became not only ritual obligation, but also a stage for prestige. The pattern set by the Etruscans of linking bloodshed with honor, duty, and status would prove enduring. When Rome eventually adopted and reshaped these customs, it would amplify them into spectacles that captivated the known world. Thus, the first chapters of gladiatorial history are written not in the sand of the Roman Colosseum, but in the tombs and burial grounds of Etruscan nobles. What began as ritual sacrifice meant to ease a soul's passage into the afterlife became a complex tradition merging spirituality, warfare, and social display. In the silence of painted tombs and the gleam of bronze artifacts, one can still trace the outlines of a practice that would one day fill vast amphitheaters with the roar of thousands. The story of the gladiator began as a sacred offering, and from that foundation it would grow into one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Rome. The social and religious framework of the Etruscan world formed the bedrock upon which early gladiatorial practices were built. To understand the weight of these funeral combats, one must first grasp the way the Etruscans perceived existence. Life and death were not separate states, but interconnected stages in a cycle overseen by divine and demonic forces. The journey after death was fraught with peril, and it was the responsibility of the living to equip the departed with spiritual defenses. This duty extended far beyond mere burial, demanding acts that demonstrated loyalty, sacrifice, and reverence. At the heart of this belief system was the conviction that blood contained life force. The Etruscans believed that the essence within blood could be transferred, nourishing the spirit of the deceased and arming it for the trials ahead. The more important the deceased, the greater the demand for blood. This logic turned the funerals of nobles and aristocrats into events where the scale of violence reflected the weight of the individual's social and political stature. For the Etruscans, bloodshed was not cruelty for its own sake, but a spiritual necessity, a bridge between the mortal world and the shadowed landscapes of the afterlife. This understanding of death was accompanied by a pantheon of deities and underworld figures whose roles reinforced the necessity of sacrifice. Aita, the ruler of the dead, demanded tribute to maintain the balance between life and death. Figures like Tuchulcha, with a vulture's head, and serpents for hair, acted as terrifying psychopomps guiding souls on their passage, but only when properly appeased. These beings did not represent abstract myth alone. They were invoked through ritual and combat, their demands met with the cries of captives forced to bleed on the ground near freshly dug graves. The spectacle, grim as it was, carried theological justification that gave it legitimacy and permanence. The role of priests ensured that these combats were structured, intentional, and aligned with divine will. Haruspices, experts in divination, read signs from animal entrails to determine how many fighters were needed, what form the contests should take, and which rituals should accompany the battles. Their decisions carried the authority of the gods, and the family hosting the funeral obeyed them without question. The presence of these religious figures lent solemnity to the events, elevating the violence beyond simple bloodshed into an act of sacred service. Each sword thrust, each fall of a captive, was framed as a gift to the spirit of the departed. Yet even as these rituals carried deep religious meaning, they also became stages for public display. Funerals were not private affairs. They were attended by family, allies, and onlookers from the community, all of whom judged the quality of the ceremonies. In such a context, the family of the deceased competed for prestige. To offer a grander spectacle than one's rivals was to claim greater honor, to demonstrate wealth, and to secure one's position in the hierarchy of society. The intersection of sacred obligation and social competition created an environment where funeral combats grew increasingly elaborate. This competitive spirit gave rise to an early form of spectacle culture. The contests became occasions where aristocrats could outdo one another, not only in reverence for the dead, but also in the grandeur of the violence presented. The blood that was shed served a dual purpose: spiritual nourishment for the deceased and social nourishment for the prestige of the living. In this sense, the Etruscan funeral games foreshadowed the Roman adaptation, where the balance between piety and political ambition would shift decisively toward public entertainment and manipulation. Despite the ritual justification, the fighters themselves occupied a tragic place within this system. They were prisoners, slaves, or condemned criminals, individuals stripped of choice, repurposed as instruments of another's journey into the afterlife. Their value lay not in who they were, but in the quality of the combat they could provide. The strongest and most skilled were selected to ensure that the fight had the appearance of genuine contest, while others might be thrown into uneven or ritualized matches where defeat was certain. For these men, the fight was not for freedom, but for the fulfillment of another's religious duty. Still, the Etruscans did not treat the combats as meaningless slaughter. Even doomed fighters were given weapons and, at least in some cases, rudimentary preparation. This ensured that the struggle had dignity, that it was marked by courage and resistance rather than helplessness. The act of fighting itself became a form of offering, an expression of vitality that was extinguished at the moment of death, releasing its essence for the benefit of the deceased. In this way, combatants became unwilling yet indispensable participants in rituals that transcended their personal fates. The mythology surrounding these practices deepened their significance. The underworld, in Etruscan imagination, was not a neutral realm, but a dangerous domain populated by hostile forces. The journey there resembled a passage through enemy territory where the soul could be intercepted, delayed, or destroyed. To spill blood at the tomb was to provide the deceased with strength and allies in that other world, a belief that merged theology with the physical act of violence. In such rituals, the boundary between religion and combat dissolved entirely. These practices also reinforced social cohesion by constantly reminding the living of the hierarchy of their world. The noble's importance was affirmed not only in life but also in death, measured by the scale of the spectacle staged in his honor. The community witnessed not only a funeral but also a performance of power, one that affirmed who held wealth, who commanded loyalty, and who could marshal the resources for such costly and violent displays. Thus, funeral games acted as both spiritual rites and public reaffirmations of the social order. When considered together, the religious beliefs, social structures, and ritual obligations of the Etruscans created a culture where violence was not accidental but essential. Death itself demanded blood, and society demanded that blood be spilled in ways that proclaimed both faith and status. From these roots, gladiatorial combat emerged not as a form of entertainment, but as an act of devotion intertwined with prestige. The Romans, inheriting these practices, would transform them into spectacles of unprecedented scale, but the sacred core of blood as gift and duty remained embedded in the tradition. The material traces left behind by the Etruscans provide some of the most vivid testimony to the role of combat in their funerary culture. Archaeological discoveries from tombs, burial grounds, and ancient settlements reveal not only the occurrence of these contests, but also their central place in ritual and society. The painted chambers of Tarquinia are among the richest sources, their walls alive with depictions of scenes that capture the essence of Etruscan funerary practices. Within these frescoes, we see masked figures, bound captives, and armed fighters locked in combat, images that transform cold stone chambers into silent witnesses of ritual violence. One notable painting shows a bound man with his head covered by a sack, fending off an attack from a dog, while a figure stands nearby holding its leash. This grim tableau demonstrates that not all combats were equal contests. Some were little more than executions performed for ritual effect, staged for the benefit of both the dead and the living. In such scenes, the cruelty of the ritual was laid bare, reminding viewers that the blood of the condemned was not wasted, but redirected into a sacred channel. The presence of a controlling figure, perhaps a priest or master of ceremonies, further underscores that these events were orchestrated with purpose and authority, not random violence. Other frescoes depict fighters clad in helmets, crested with plumes, and carrying round shields. These images suggest duels closer to what we might recognize as gladiatorial combat, with warriors facing one another in armed struggle. The attention to detail in the depictions, the curve of a shield, the stance of a fighter, the exact design of a helmet, suggests observation rather than imagination. These paintings were not symbolic abstractions, but reflections of actual events that artists had witnessed or been instructed to reproduce faithfully. The tomb of the augurs, dating to the early 6th century BC, provides a striking example. One scene depicts a figure raising his hand in a gesture that may indicate a command to begin combat. Nearby, fighters stand prepared, their postures hinting at tension before the clash. Such imagery demonstrates that these contests had a ceremonial framework beginning and ending at designated moments, shaped by ritual signals. It is in these silent gestures preserved on stone that we glimpse the seeds of the highly choreographed gladiatorial spectacles that the Romans would later perfect. Material evidence from Vulci adds further weight to these interpretations. Excavations there have uncovered bronze helmets adorned with intricate designs, fragments of shields, and short swords crafted with unusual care. These were not battlefield remnants casually reused for funerary purposes, but specialized equipment intended for ritualized combat. The quality of their construction, sometimes impractical for prolonged warfare, suggests they were designed for display and ceremonial use, to dazzle spectators even as they served their brutal purpose. The presence of such artifacts points to an industry of craftsmen who catered specifically to funerary needs. foreshadowing the vast economic networks that would one day surround Roman gladiatorial games. Weapons themselves carried symbolic weight. The short sword, later to be known as the gladius, made its appearance in these funerary contexts, its form already hinting at the role it would play in shaping Roman martial identity. Shields, too, varied in size and design, indicating experimentation with forms that would eventually become standardized. The diversity of arms suggests that variety was deliberately cultivated, providing audiences with contrasts in style and technique. Even at this early stage, there was an appreciation for combat as a performance, a recognition that different weapons and armor could generate different forms of drama. The artifacts also reveal something of the scale of investment required. Forging bronze helmets, crafting swords, and preparing shields for ritual use demanded time, resources, and skilled labor. Families that staged such funerary combats were therefore making statements of wealth and power as much as piety. The dead were honored with offerings that proclaimed the prominence of their lineage, while onlookers recognized the spectacle as evidence of the family's capacity to command both material and human resources. This interplay of devotion and display embedded combat within the very fabric of Etruscan social identity. The archaeological record extends beyond weapons and paintings to include traces of infrastructure. Evidence of enclosures, raised platforms, and designated areas for ceremonies suggest that funerary combats were not spontaneous but carefully organized events. Temporary arenas, constructed from wood or stone, provided spaces where fighters could clash under the watchful eyes of priests, family, and community. These arrangements emphasized order and structure, ensuring that even in death, the rituals of society were upheld. All of these sources converge to paint a picture of a culture in which ritualized violence was woven deeply into the rhythms of life and death. The frescoes capture the human dimension of fear, struggle, and dominance. The artifacts testify to craftsmanship and ritual investment. The architectural remains reveal the staging required to transform combat into sacred performance. Together they create a mosaic of evidence that the Etruscans did not merely tolerate violence but sanctified it, transforming it into an offering and a display. This body of material also allows us to trace continuity into Roman practice. The helmets and shields of Tarquinia anticipate the standardized gear of Roman gladiators. The gestures of priests and overseers foreshadow the Roman editors who would control the rhythm of the games. The specialized manufacture of ritual weapons prefigures the massive industries that would later thrive on the demand for gladiatorial equipment. Each fragment, each painting, each artifact is a thread in the tapestry of a tradition that began in the shadowed tombs of Etruria and would one day fill the Colosseum with thunderous applause. The archaeological record thus stands as a silent chronicle of a society that found meaning in the shedding of blood. It tells us that the story of the gladiator was not born suddenly in Rome, but grew from centuries of practice in which ritual, art, and violence converged. The dead were honored, the living were impressed, and through combat, the Etruscans sought to maintain the fragile balance between the world of the living and the mysteries of the afterlife. The influence of Etruscan military traditions on funeral combat was unmistakable. Their armies were known for discipline, skill, and adaptability, and these qualities filtered directly into the structure of ritualized violence. The battlefield and the burial ground were closely linked in their culture. Weapons, armor, and tactics honed in war became instruments of sacred ceremony, ensuring that combat at funerals reflected not only religious duty, but also the martial identity of the people. Among the weapons most frequently associated with these contests was the short, thrusting sword. Measuring around 2 feet in length, it allowed for quick, precise movements, ideal for close-quarter fighting. The weapon demanded agility and skill, rewarding fighters who could maneuver quickly within a confined space. This design would later influence the Roman gladius, the blade that would become synonymous with gladiators themselves. In pairing the short sword with various shields, the Etruscans encouraged diversity in combat, creating contests that displayed different tactical approaches. Shields varied widely in size and form, from the small circular clipius to larger oval models resembling the scutum. Each required a unique fighting style. The larger shields provided superior coverage, allowing fighters to advance methodically while maintaining protection. Smaller shields demanded agility, quick parries, and offensive initiative. This variety foreshadowed the gladiatorial classes of Rome, where fighters were distinguished as much by their equipment as by their tactics. Helmets also carried both practical and symbolic weight. Crafted from bronze and often adorned with elaborate crests, they protected the head while presenting a striking appearance. Some included face guards that transformed combatants into anonymous figures of ritual sacrifice, emphasizing the symbolic role they played over their individual identity. The decorative elements of these helmets, feathers, animal motifs, or intricate patterns, demonstrated the blending of artistry and violence, making the fighters both instruments of bloodshed and visual offerings. The fighting styles themselves reflected adaptations of battlefield techniques for ceremonial use. Etruscan warriors were trained in thrusting, slashing, and shield work, skills they transferred into funeral combats. The duels were not chaotic brawls but structured encounters that required knowledge of weapon handling and tactical awareness. In many respects, these contests were condensed versions of the clashes that took place in real battles, staged not for conquest, but for ritual fulfillment. Influence from neighboring cultures enriched this martial tradition. As the Etruscans engaged in conflicts with various peoples, Samnites, Gauls, Greeks, they encountered different weapons and tactics. The long swords of Celtic warriors, the lighter armor of Samnites, and the spear techniques of Greek hoplites all left their mark. Etruscan combat at funerals thus became a melting pot of martial styles, incorporating elements from across the Mediterranean. This diversity created greater spectacle and provided a foundation for the elaborate classifications of gladiators that Rome would later formalize. Training practices also bore traces of military order. Captured prisoners, selected for strength or skill, were not simply thrown into combat unprepared. Brief but structured training was provided, enough to ensure that their fights would be more than clumsy exchanges. Experienced warriors oversaw this instruction, teaching weapon handling, stance, and basic maneuvers. Though the time was short, the aim was to produce contests that had dignity and drama. The presence of such training prefigured the Roman ludus, the gladiatorial school where professional fighters would one day be prepared for the arena. The role of preparation extended beyond combatants to the rituals surrounding the fight. Priests and overseers ensured that the contests followed prescribed forms, echoing the discipline of military campaigns. Just as a general organized his troops before battle, so too were funeral games organized with attention to sequence, order, and symbolism. Every detail, from the opening gestures to the conclusion of combat, was shaped by a mixture of martial precision and sacred ritual. This combination of military practice and religious duty gave Etruscan funeral games a unique character. They were not random acts of cruelty, but structured ceremonies where violence was disciplined, purposeful, and loaded with meaning. The blood spilled on the ground carried echoes of the battlefield, while also serving as nourishment for the journey of the dead. In this way, the Etruscans established a model where war and ritual converged, each reinforcing the other. These precedents proved decisive when the Romans later adopted and expanded upon the tradition. Rome inherited not only the idea of combat as a funerary duty, but also the martial framework that made such contests compelling to audiences. The discipline of the Etruscan military, the diversity of their weapons and tactics, and their fusion of artistry with violence laid the groundwork for the gladiatorial system that would grow into one of the most recognizable institutions of Roman culture. What began as ritual sacrifice had, by the end of the Etruscan age, already developed the features of organized spectacle. Equipment was crafted with care, fighters were trained with discipline, and combat was staged with deliberate structure. These elements ensured that when Rome absorbed the tradition, it did not inherit a crude practice but a mature system ready to be reshaped into political theatre on a grand scale. The transformation of gladiatorial combat from sacred ritual into public spectacle began with a moment of adaptation on Roman soil. In 264 BC, two brothers, Marcus and Decimus Junius Brutus Pera, organized a funeral ceremony to honor their deceased father. Unlike the Etruscans, who had maintained combat primarily as a religious duty, the Romans infused the occasion with political ambition and public display. It was here, in the Forum Boarium, Rome's bustling cattle market, that the first recorded gladiatorial games took place. The setting itself carried symbolic resonance. The Forum Boarium was not a secluded burial ground but a commercial and social hub of the city, a place where people gathered to trade, negotiate, and observe. By staging the funeral games there, the Brutus brothers transformed a private ritual into a public performance. Wooden seating was erected, and the citizens of Rome assembled to watch three pairs of fighters battle to the death. The spectacle retained its original funerary justification, but the emphasis had shifted. The crowd's attention was drawn less to the soul of the departed and more to the courage, skill, and fate of the combatants. The fighters chosen for this event were prisoners of war, drawn from recent Roman campaigns against the Samnites and Gauls. Each pair represented a different ethnic background and fighting style, ensuring variety and drama. One duel might pit a Samnite armed with distinctive gear against a Gallic warrior with a long sword and shield, while another matched a Roman deserter against a Germanic tribesman. These contrasts echoed the diversity of Rome's enemies, turning the funeral games into a microcosm of Roman military triumphs. The audience, in cheering, not only honored the deceased, but also relived Rome's victories on the battlefield. Unlike the Etruscan ceremonies where ritual overshadowed contest, the Roman version highlighted the combat itself. Fighters saluted the funeral mask of the deceased before engaging, acknowledging the sacred purpose of the occasion. Yet once the battle commenced, the contest was genuine. These were not executions staged for effect, but struggles in which skill, endurance, and fortune determined survival. For the first time, gladiatorial combat emerged as an event where fighters might earn reprieve or recognition through their performance. The possibility of survival added tension and unpredictability, drawing the spectators deeper into the drama. The political dimension of the games was clear. By sponsoring the spectacle, the Brutus family demonstrated wealth, piety, and devotion to tradition, while also winning admiration from the crowd. Citizens left the event remembering not only the departed consul, but also the generosity and ambition of his sons. In this way, gladiatorial combat became a political tool, a method of cultivating public favor through the language of spectacle. What began as filial duty was transformed into a strategy of influence. The response of the Roman public was immediate and enthusiastic. What had begun as a solemn ritual unfolded into gripping entertainment that transcended social boundaries. Senators, merchants, and common citizens sat side by side, united in their fascination with the raw courage and desperation displayed before them. The cries of the combatants, the clash of weapons, and the final moments of victory or death bound the audience together in shared emotion. This collective experience revealed the immense potential of gladiatorial combat as a force for shaping public sentiment. Within a generation, other Roman families began to adopt the practice. Funeral games became more elaborate, each sponsor seeking to outshine rivals. The number of fighters increased, the venues expanded, and the organization grew more sophisticated. By the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial combat had become a fixture of Roman funerals for the aristocracy. with expectations that the scale of the spectacle should match or exceed that of competitors. The contest had shifted from serving the dead to serving the living, from sacred obligation to political theatre. The evolution marked a turning point in the history of gladiators. Rome did not discard the religious justification entirely. Funerals still provided the official context, but the weight of meaning had tipped. No longer confined to the realm of ritual, combat was now a means of generating awe, winning loyalty, and demonstrating generosity. Violence had been harnessed as a tool of power, a way to influence hearts and minds through the visceral spectacle of life and death. This shift set the stage for the centuries to come. As gladiatorial games expanded beyond funerals, they became detached from their original function and were increasingly linked to festivals, campaigns, and moments of political necessity. The spark lit in the Forum Boreum would grow into a roaring fire, one that would illuminate amphitheaters across the Roman world. What had once been a sacred gift to the dead was now a performance for the living, a transformation that forever altered the trajectory of gladiatorial history. The rapid expansion of gladiatorial games in Rome was not simply the result of fascination with bloodshed. It was driven by the political ambitions of Rome's elite. From the very beginning, the funerary contests sponsored by powerful families carried as much weight in the political sphere as they did in the religious one. The Brutus brothers had demonstrated that combat could elevate a family's prestige, bind citizens through shared spectacle, and project an image of generosity. Other aristocrats quickly realized that games could be used to capture attention, sway public opinion, and build networks of loyalty in a society where competition for influence was fierce. Rome in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC was a republic defined by rivalry among its ruling class. Political advancement depended on reputation, the ability to win elections, and the cultivation of popular support. Public display was therefore essential, and gladiatorial games offered a uniquely powerful means of achieving it. Unlike statues or temples which stood silently as symbols of wealth, games engaged the senses directly. The roar of the crowd, the shock of combat, and the shared experience of life and death created bonds between spectators and sponsors that no monument could replicate. The games were staged under the official pretense of honoring the dead, but the public quickly understood the secondary motives. Aristocrats who sponsored larger and more lavish spectacles demonstrated their resources and commitment to traditional values, all while placing themselves at the center of public attention. A senator who provided dozens of fighters gained a reputation for generosity and strength, while one who offered only a modest display risked seeming weak or neglectful of duty. In this environment, competition escalated naturally, with each family striving to surpass the last in scale and grandeur. The political implications were immense. Sponsorship of gladiatorial games became a form of campaigning long before elections. Citizens who were entertained remembered the name of the sponsor, and gratitude translated into political loyalty. Candidates who sought office could present themselves as men of virtue, courage, and wealth by sponsoring spectacles that appealed to the masses. This created a cycle where ambition demanded ever greater displays, which in turn fueled the growth of gladiatorial culture. The editors, the official title given to the men who organized the games, held complete responsibility for their success or failure. They determined the number of fighters, the length of the spectacle, and the quality of the presentation. A successful editor could win widespread admiration, while a disappointing one faced ridicule and political damage. The stakes were high and the costs immense. To host even a modest series of contests required vast sums for equipment, fighters, organization, and public accommodations. Wealthy families often risked financial ruin in order to outshine rivals, mortgaging estates, or borrowing heavily to finance spectacles. Yet many were willing to do so, calculating that the political rewards outweighed the economic dangers. By the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial games had firmly entrenched themselves within the rhythms of Roman public life. No longer confined to funerals, they began to appear in other contexts: festivals, commemorations, and political campaigns. Ambitious politicians recognized that timing was everything. To host games during an election year or on the eve of a major decision was to ensure one's name echoed in the minds of voters. The games thus became instruments of political calculation, as carefully orchestrated as speeches or alliances. The Roman people themselves grew accustomed to expecting such gifts. The more spectacles they received, the more they demanded. Citizens judged their leaders not only by their actions in government, but also by the quality of entertainment they provided. A candidate who failed to stage memorable games risked being forgotten, while one who did so could rally the crowd to his side with thunderous applause. The forum and the battlefield still mattered, but so too did the arena, where reputation was forged before tens of thousands of witnesses. In this climate, gladiatorial games evolved from private acts of piety into public performances inseparable from political life. They served as demonstrations of wealth, as declarations of loyalty to tradition, and as powerful tools of persuasion. Violence, once a sacred gift to the dead, had been fully harnessed as a political weapon wielded by the ambitious. The Republic, already a place of rivalry and spectacle, now had a new stage where the struggle for power could be fought indirectly through the blood of gladiators. As the practice of gladiatorial games spread beyond their Etruscan roots and the first Roman experiment in the Forum Boarium, their scale and intensity expanded with remarkable speed. What began with 3 pairs of fighters in honor of a single nobleman soon grew into spectacles involving dozens of combatants, staged over multiple days, and attracting audiences from across the city. The appetite of the Roman people for such contests became evident almost immediately, and with each passing decade, the games became more deeply woven into the fabric of civic life. By the early 2nd century BC, the expectation that prominent funerals would include gladiatorial combat had become entrenched. Families competed to outdo one another, staging ever larger and more elaborate events. A modest display of a few pairs of fighters no longer impressed citizens. The measure of a family's devotion and influence was the number of combatants it could provide, and the scale of the spectacle it could orchestrate. What had once been rare became frequent, and what had once been solemn ritual began to transform into anticipated entertainment. The public's enthusiasm grew with each contest. For the masses of Rome, citizens whose lives were often marked by hardship, labor, and political exclusion, the games offered a space of collective emotion and shared identity. In the arena, distinctions between patrician and plebeian blurred as both classes shouted encouragement, expressed outrage, and invested themselves in the fate of the fighters. Here, in the amphitheater or temporary wooden structures erected in forums, the Roman populace experienced a sense of unity. This collective experience became a powerful force, and politicians quickly learned to exploit it. The rapid expansion of gladiatorial games also altered the role of the fighters themselves. No longer limited to captives or criminals facing certain death, the contests began to feature individuals trained for the purpose of combat. The shift was subtle at first, as families sought to ensure that their games displayed skill and drama rather than clumsy slaughter. Over time, however, the emergence of professional gladiators gave the contests a new dimension. Fighters now entered the arena not only as sacrifices but also as performers, embodying martial skill and theatrical courage. The diversity of combat grew as well. Instead of uniform duels, games began to feature opponents with contrasting weapons, armor, and tactics. One fighter might be heavily armored, carrying a large shield and short sword, while another appeared with lighter gear and greater mobility. These contrasts created dramatic tension, ensuring that each fight offered novelty and unpredictability. Variety became a hallmark of the games, foreshadowing the carefully structured gladiatorial categories that would later dominate Roman arenas. At the same time, the organization of the games became more sophisticated. Sponsors employed overseers, trainers, and logistical staff to manage the fighters and ensure that the contests unfolded smoothly. Temporary arenas were equipped with seating, barriers, and designated areas for different classes of spectators. The events themselves followed ritualized sequences, beginning with processions, introductions, and salutes before the combat commenced. These refinements elevated the games from spontaneous displays of violence into structured spectacles with clear beginnings, climaxes, and conclusions. The psychological impact of these early spectacles should not be underestimated. Citizens who witnessed the contests were enthralled by the courage of fighters who faced death with resolve, by the drama of uncertain outcomes, and by the sense of participating in a moment larger than themselves. The games became conversations across the city, their details repeated in markets, taverns, and homes. To attend and discuss them was to be part of Rome's cultural life, to share in the collective memory of blood and valor. The growing popularity of gladiatorial games also began to reshape the expectations of Roman politics. Ambitious men realized that to secure favor, they must provide not only policies or promises, but also entertainment on a grand scale. The crowd rewarded those who gave generously with loyalty, and punished those who offered meager or uninspired games with mockery and disdain. The fate of political careers became increasingly tied to the arena, and gladiatorial combat moved from funerary duty into the realm of civic necessity. What had begun as sacred ritual was now fully transformed into a cultural institution. By the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial contests had become fixtures of Roman public life, growing in scale, frequency, and complexity. They were no longer marginal or occasional events, but essential expressions of Roman identity, embodying the values of courage, endurance, and martial skill, while simultaneously serving as instruments of political power and popular control. The figure of the editor emerged as one of the most important roles in the developing tradition of gladiatorial games. The term referred to the sponsor of the spectacle, the person who bore the responsibility for organizing, financing, and presenting the contests. In the earliest days, the editor was usually a family member of the deceased, fulfilling the duty of honoring the dead. But as the games expanded in scope and significance, the role shifted into a position of immense political and social weight. The editor was no longer simply a mourner, he became a public benefactor, a politician, and at times a manipulator of the masses. The duties of an editor extended across every detail of the games. He determined how many fighters would be engaged, which types of combat would be presented, how long the games would last, and what kind of equipment and setting would be provided. He also had to oversee the acquisition and training of gladiators, either by purchasing them from private owners or by hiring them from a lanista, a professional trainer and dealer. Every choice reflected upon his reputation. A poorly equipped or disorganized spectacle could ruin the credibility of the sponsor, while a lavish and thrilling series of combats could immortalize his name in the memory of citizens. The financial demands of this role were staggering. To supply fighters, armor, weapons, and logistical support for even a single day of contests often required sums equivalent to years of income for a moderately wealthy Roman. Larger spectacles could bankrupt families entirely. Many editors mortgaged their estates, borrowed heavily, or drew on the wealth of their allies in order to stage games that would eclipse those of their rivals. In this way, the gladiatorial system fed on ambition and rivalry, driving men to sacrifice fortune in the hope of gaining influence. Yet the potential rewards were just as great. A successful editor could capture the admiration of thousands, turning popular gratitude into political capital. In a society where public opinion shaped careers, The ability to please the masses with grand entertainment was invaluable. The games offered a form of direct communication between sponsor and citizen, bypassing the complexities of political assemblies or senatorial debate. A man who staged magnificent contests demonstrated not only his wealth, but also his generosity, courage, and devotion to tradition. These qualities could propel him to higher office and strengthen his position in the hierarchy of the Republic. The editor also controlled the narrative of the games. He could decide whether to highlight the courage of Rome's military traditions, to showcase exotic fighters from conquered territories, or to emphasize the values of discipline and endurance. By carefully selecting matchups, costumes, and rituals, the editor shaped the way the games were remembered. This power extended into symbolism. A particular pairing of fighters might evoke memories of recent military victories, reinforcing Rome's identity as a conquering power. In this sense, the editor wielded culture as well as spectacle, crafting messages that resonated with the audience beyond the arena. The risks, however, were immense. Failure to deliver adequate entertainment could lead to public scorn. Citizens, once accustomed to increasingly elaborate displays, were quick to express disappointment. An editor who staged meager games risked ridicule in the marketplace, damaging his reputation and undermining his political ambitions. The fickle nature of the crowd added to the danger. What might satisfy one year could be dismissed as inadequate the next, forcing editors into an endless cycle of escalation. The result was a culture where extravagance became the norm, and moderation was interpreted as weakness. Despite these risks, the institution of the editor became a cornerstone of Roman public life. It tied the fates of individuals to the spectacle of combat, linking personal ambition to the blood spilled in the arena. The games were no longer simply about honoring the dead or entertaining the crowd. They had become instruments of power, controlled and directed by those willing to bear the cost. The editor embodied this transformation, standing as both benefactor and gambler, staking his fortune and reputation on the unpredictable drama of gladiatorial combat. In the figure of the editor, one can see the merging of sacred tradition, political calculation, and popular entertainment. He was at once priest and politician, financier and impresario, judge and showman. Through his decisions, the games were shaped into a mirror of Roman society, reflecting its values of honor, courage, and discipline, while also exposing its hunger for spectacle and its capacity for cruelty. It was under the guidance of the editor that the games would continue to grow, expanding in size, complexity, and significance until they became inseparable from the identity of Rome itself. The rise of the Lanistae marked a crucial stage in the evolution of gladiatorial games, transforming the contests from occasional displays into a structured and enduring institution. The lanista was the professional trainer, organizer, and dealer of gladiators, a figure both essential and despised within Roman society. While editors bore the glory of sponsoring spectacles, it was the lanista who provided the fighters, ensured their readiness, and managed the complex logistics behind each performance. Without the lanista, the editor's vision could not be realized. The lanista operated gladiatorial schools known as ludi, where fighters were housed, trained, and disciplined. These establishments resembled military barracks with strict routines, harsh discipline, and constant preparation. Fighters lived under the watchful eyes of trainers and guards, their lives reduced to cycles of exercise, instruction, and combat drills. The schools were both prisons and academies of violence, designed to transform captives, slaves, and criminals into skilled performers capable of thrilling audiences with displays of courage and martial skill. The methods of training reflected the military roots of gladiatorial combat. Fighters were drilled relentlessly in weapon handling, footwork, and tactical maneuvering. Wooden swords and wicker shields were used in the early stages to reduce injury, while sparring partners and trainers pushed recruits to their limits. Endurance was prized, as games could last for hours and demand repeated displays of stamina. The lanista employed experienced veterans, often retired gladiators themselves, to pass on practical knowledge of combat and survival. These men, scarred from years in the arena, embodied the hard lessons of their craft and ensured that new fighters absorbed them. The lanista's business model was rooted in both risk and profit. He purchased slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals at low cost and invested in their training. If a fighter survived long enough to become skilled, his value increased dramatically. Editors were willing to pay high fees for proven gladiators who could guarantee dramatic contests. The lanista thus balanced losses from deaths against gains from successful performers, treating human lives as assets in a carefully calculated economy of blood. Some gladiators were rented for specific games, while others were sold outright to wealthy families seeking to maintain their own private stables of fighters. Despite their importance, lanistae carried a stigma in Roman society. They were viewed as tainted by their trade, associated with blood, death, and the corruption of free men into instruments of spectacle. To deal in human suffering was seen as dishonorable, and lanistae were often excluded from respectable circles. Yet this disdain did not diminish their power. They commanded wealth, maintained networks across the empire, and held influence over editors desperate to secure fighters for their games. The paradox of contempt and dependence defined the lanista's role. Despised publicly but courted privately, condemned socially but indispensable practically. The fighters themselves came from diverse backgrounds. Many were enslaved foreigners captured during Rome's constant wars, their bodies repurposed for entertainment. Others were criminals condemned to the arena, marked for death, but trained to prolong their usefulness. Over time, however, a surprising category emerged: free men who volunteered to become gladiators. These individuals signed contracts with lanistae, binding themselves to service in exchange for pay, housing, and the chance at fame. Though stigmatized, some saw the arena as an escape from poverty or a path to honor through the admiration of the crowd. Their presence complicated the social image of gladiators, blurring the line between victim and performer. The ludi themselves became institutions of reputation. Capua, in particular, gained renown for its gladiatorial schools, producing fighters whose skill and courage were celebrated across Rome. These establishments developed specialized training regimes, focusing on different fighting styles, weapons, and tactics. A gladiator trained in Capua, or another famous ludus, carried the prestige of his school with him into the arena, much like a soldier identified with a renowned legion. The fame of certain schools grew so great that emperors themselves would one day sponsor state-run ludi to ensure control of the trade. The rise of the lanistae and their schools also had broader cultural consequences. By institutionalizing gladiatorial training, they ensured that the games could expand in scale indefinitely. No longer dependent on the chance capture of prisoners or the supply of condemned criminals, editors could rely on a steady flow of trained fighters ready for performance. This professionalization turned gladiatorial combat into a self-sustaining industry, one that employed craftsmen, armorers, doctors, and entertainers alongside the fighters themselves. The arena became not just a place of death, but the center of a vast economic network. In this way, the lanista represented the hidden machinery of Roman spectacle. While the editor basked in the cheers of the crowd, it was the lanista who made those cheers possible. His schools forged men into instruments of drama, his contracts fueled the trade in human bodies, and his harsh discipline created the foundation of the gladiatorial system. He was at once a symbol of Rome's cruelty and its pragmatism, embodying the paradox at the heart of the games, that death could be managed, commodified, and sold for profit. Life inside the gladiatorial school was defined by training, discipline, and the constant shadow of death. From the moment a recruit entered the ludus, whether as a captive, a condemned criminal, or a volunteer, his existence was reshaped into that of a fighter. The lanista and his trainers understood that survival in the arena depended not on brute strength alone, but on conditioning, skill, and mental readiness. Thus, the daily routine of a gladiator was rigorous and unrelenting, designed to forge bodies and minds capable of enduring the most demanding contests. The foundation of training lay in physical conditioning. Gladiators were drilled in strength, endurance, and agility with exercises that mirrored both military training and athletic preparation. Wooden poles planted in the training yards served as sparring dummies against which fighters practiced strikes, thrusts, and defensive maneuvers for hours at a time. Weighted wooden swords, heavier than real weapons, built muscle and trained the body for the lighter feel of true steel in combat. Running, wrestling, and repetitive drills kept gladiators fit, while strict regimens of diet and rest ensured that their bodies could withstand the punishing demands of combat. Diet played a surprisingly important role in this preparation. Far from starving, gladiators were fed a carefully managed diet designed to build mass and sustain energy. Archaeological evidence, including bone analysis from gladiatorial cemeteries, shows that fighters consumed large amounts of barley, beans, and other plant-based foods. This carbohydrate-rich diet earned them the nickname hordearii, or barley men. The high-energy meals helped develop a layer of body fat that not only served as fuel, but also provided a degree of protection against shallow cuts, making the spectacle bloodier but less immediately fatal. Fighters were thus prepared to withstand injuries and prolong the drama in the arena. Weapon training was the core of gladiatorial instruction. Each recruit was assigned a particular fighting style, complete with specialized weapons and armor. A man destined to become a mormillo trained with a heavy rectangular shield and short sword, learning how to fight with patience and strength. Another, prepared as a retiarius, practiced agility and speed with his net and trident, mastering the art of entangling opponents and striking from a distance. Each class of gladiator demanded its own techniques, and trainers drilled their pupils relentlessly until movements became instinctive. Repetition was the essence of mastery, and a gladiator's survival often depended on his ability to react automatically in the chaos of combat. Instruction was provided by experienced veterans, often retired gladiators who had earned their freedom but chose to remain within the ludus as instructors. These men, scarred and hardened by years in the arena, carried a wealth of knowledge about tactics, timing, and the psychology of survival. They emphasized not only skill with weapons, but also the ability to read an opponent, to exploit weaknesses, and to anticipate attacks. In this way, training went beyond mechanical drills into the realm of strategy and intuition. Discipline was enforced with severity. Gladiators lived under strict rules, with punishments for disobedience ranging from extra drills to brutal beatings. The lanista demanded order, knowing that chaos in the school would translate to disaster in the arena. Fights between gladiators outside of training were strictly controlled, as injuries could ruin valuable investments. Despite this harshness, bonds often formed among the fighters, forged by shared struggle and the knowledge that they lived on the edge of mortality. These relationships could provide strength in training, though in the arena they might one day be pitted against one another. Psychological preparation was as important as physical conditioning. Gladiators were taught to confront death with composure, to accept pain without breaking, and to face the crowd with courage. Rituals such as saluting the sponsor or addressing the audience before combat reinforced the idea that they were not merely men, but instruments of spectacle. The discipline of the school demanded that fear be mastered, not eliminated, but controlled, so that it became fuel for performance rather than paralysis. A gladiator who quailed or begged for mercy too quickly risked dishonor, while one who fought bravely even in defeat could earn the admiration of the crowd and perhaps the chance of reprieve. Daily life in the ludus followed a repetitive cycle. Mornings began with exercises and drills, followed by sparring sessions under the eyes of trainers. Afternoons were often spent in rehearsals of specific tactics or in maintenance of weapons and armor. Evenings provided rest, meals, and preparation for the next day's training. The monotony of this existence was broken only by the looming reality of combat. Each man knew that at any moment his name could be chosen for the next games, that the drills he repeated endlessly would soon be tested before thousands of spectators, and that his fate might be decided by the turn of a sword or the gesture of a sponsor. Despite the harshness, the system produced men who were admired as much as they were feared. Their bodies were honed, their skills sharpened, their minds conditioned to endure what most free citizens could not imagine. While they were still slaves or condemned criminals in the eyes of the law, in the arena they became performers whose courage and ability captivated audiences. The paradox of their existence was clear. Trained as instruments of death, yet celebrated as symbols of strength, they embodied the contradictions at the heart of Roman spectacle. The earliest gladiatorial types emerged directly from the ethnic and military identities of Rome's enemies. When prisoners of war were forced into combat, they often fought with the equipment and styles associated with their own people. Over time, these styles were formalized into gladiatorial categories that not only provided variety for the audience, but also reinforced Roman narratives of conquest and superiority. To watch a Samnite, a Thracian, or a Gaul fight in the arena was to relive Rome's victories over those very peoples, transforming past wars into ongoing spectacles of dominance. The Samnite was one of the first and most recognizable types, armed with the heavy scutum, a large rectangular shield, and the short gladius sword. The Samnite reflected the equipment of Rome's southern Italian enemies. His helmet was often crested and sometimes adorned with feathers, lending him a striking appearance. The Samnite style emphasized strength, endurance, and the ability to withstand pressure behind the broad cover of his shield. To Romans, watching a Samnite fight in the arena carried layered meaning. It was both a reminder of past wars in Campania and a display of how enemies, once defeated in battle, now served Rome even in death. The Thracian, or Thraex, offered a contrasting image. His distinctive curved sword, the Sica, was designed to hook around shields and armor, forcing opponents into defensive positions. He carried a small square or round shield, which demanded agility and constant movement to compensate for its limited coverage. His helmet, decorated with a tall crest and often featuring a visor shaped like a griffin or other animal, made him instantly recognizable in the arena. The Thracian style emphasized quick strikes, mobility, and cunning, qualities that set him apart from the heavy, methodical Samnite. For Roman audiences, the Thracian symbolized the exotic East, the untamed frontiers, and the thrill of foreign styles of combat. The Gaul was another prominent type in the early games, drawing on Rome's long and bitter conflicts with Gallic tribes. Originally equipped with long swords, oval shields, and heavy helmets with high crests, the Gaulish gladiator represented the barbarian archetype, large, fierce, and savage. The Gauls had once sacked Rome itself in 390 BC, a humiliation etched deep into Roman memory. To see Gauls fight and die in the arena was to reverse that trauma, transforming fear into spectacle. Over time, the Gaul type evolved into the mumio, a gladiator with a broad helmet adorned with a fish-shaped crest, armed with sword and shield. This transformation illustrates how Rome absorbed the image of the barbarian and refashioned it into a lasting symbol of the games. Each of these types reflected more than combat styles. They carried symbolic weight that resonated with Roman audiences. The The Samnite reminded spectators of victories in Italy, the Thracian embodied the strangeness of Eastern enemies, and the Gaul conjured memories of barbarian invasions subdued by Roman might. Watching them fight was not only entertaining, but also affirming of Roman superiority. The arena became a theatre of conquest where enemies of the past continued to be defeated in ritual form, their struggles reaffirming Rome's dominance. The pairing of different types created deliberate contrasts that heightened the drama. A heavily armed Samnite might face a nimble Thracian, creating a contest of power versus agility. A Gaul might be matched against a Roman-style fighter, replaying in miniature the clashes of entire campaigns. These matchups gave audiences a sense of variety and narrative, as each combat represented more than a simple duel. It symbolized a broader struggle between cultures, tactics, and identities. The emergence of these gladiatorial types also marked the beginning of a system of categorization that would define the games for centuries. No longer were fighters simply prisoners forced to use whatever weapons they carried into captivity. They were now assigned roles, equipped with standardized gear, and trained to fight according to specific tactics. This system provided consistency for organizers, variety for audiences, and a framework that could expand as new enemies were encountered and new styles introduced. What began as reflections of Rome's enemies gradually transformed into theatrical archetypes. The Samnite, Thracian, and Gaul were no longer merely captives but symbolic figures frozen in combat roles that outlived their historical peoples. Their presence in the arena told stories of conquest and control, of foreign styles subdued and repurposed for Roman entertainment. In this way, gladiatorial types became living embodiments of Rome's narrative of supremacy, staged again and again for the crowd to witness. As gladiatorial combat became a permanent fixture of Roman society, the early ethnic types, the Samnite, Thracian, and Gaul, evolved into standardized classes with clearly defined weapons, armor, and tactics. This system of classification was not only practical for training and organization, but also essential for maintaining variety and drama in the arena. By creating a roster of distinct gladiator categories, each with strengths and weaknesses, Roman organizers ensured that every fight carried balance, unpredictability, and symbolic meaning. The Murmillo emerged as the successor to the Gaul, equipped with a heavy rectangular scutum shield and the short gladius sword. The Murmillo was designed for endurance and steady pressure. His helmet, large and enclosing, bore a crest shaped like a fish, giving him a distinctive appearance. The Murmillo's fighting style emphasized defensive strength and measured attacks, using the shield both as protection and as a weapon to batter opponents. His bulk and stability made him a formidable presence, but his limited mobility left him vulnerable to faster adversaries. In the carefully orchestrated matchups of the arena, the Murmillo was often pitted against lighter, more agile types, creating a contest of resilience against speed. The Thracian, or Thraex, retained his identity as a nimble and cunning fighter, but became more formalized. He carried the small palmular shield, which required constant movement to compensate for its limited size. His curved seeker sword remained his signature weapon, designed to reach around the defenses of heavily shielded opponents. The Thracian's helmet grew increasingly elaborate, often featuring tall crests and decorated visors, making him a visually striking figure in the arena. His role was to provide contrast to the heavy Murmillo, turning their encounters into carefully balanced struggles of power versus dexterity. The Hoplomachus was modeled after Greek hoplites. He wore a round bronze helmet and carried a small circular shield, along with a long spear and short sword. His style emphasized thrusting attacks and quick footwork, demanding agility and tactical awareness. He was often paired against the Murmillo, his spear allowing him to strike from range, but leaving him vulnerable if the heavier fighter closed the distance. The hoplomachus symbolized Rome's encounters with the Greek world, turning the cultural memory of hoplite warfare into staged spectacle. The retiarius represented the most radical departure from traditional, heavy-armored types. Armed with a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger, he wore little armor beyond a shoulder guard called a gallerus. His appearance was striking, bare-chested, mobile, and reliant on speed and technique rather than brute strength. The retiarius used his net to entangle opponents, his trident to strike from a distance, and his agility to evade blows. He was often matched against the secutor, a heavily armored fighter whose smooth helmet was designed to prevent entanglement in the net. This pairing became one of the most iconic in gladiatorial combat, embodying the tension between lightness and heaviness, freedom and constraint, cunning and force. The secutor, designed specifically to face the retiarius, carried the same basic equipment as the murmillo, but with modifications. His helmet had a smooth, rounded surface with small eye holes, preventing the retiarius from catching it with the net. The secutor relied on endurance and steady pressure, using his shield to block attacks and his gladius to strike when the retiarius faltered. The match between retiarius and secutor was one of contrasts, playing on themes of predator and prey, improvisation versus discipline, and spectacle born from imbalance made thrilling by skill. Other standardized classes expanded the repertoire of combat. The eques fought on horseback with a spear before dismounting to continue with a short sword, offering audiences the novelty of mounted combat. The Dimachurus wielded two swords, displaying ambidexterity and relentless aggression. The Esidarius recreated Celtic chariot warfare, driving into the arena with speed before engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Each type added new layers of variety, ensuring that no two games felt identical. The system of categorization created a balance that audiences came to expect. Fights were not random duels, but orchestrated pairings designed for dramatic contrast. Heavy versus light, shield versus agility, spear versus sword. These matchups offered endless combinations, each with its own narrative tension. Organizers and trainers understood the psychology of spectacle, arranging combats that would maximize excitement while maintaining a sense of fairness and unpredictability. Beyond entertainment, these standardized classes carried symbolic meanings that reinforced Roman values. The murmillo's discipline reflected Roman ideals of order and strength. The Thracians' cunning evoked the exoticism of foreign lands, and the retiarius, often mocked as effeminate due to his lack of armor, reminded audiences of the dangers of straying too far from Roman martial ideals. Through their equipment and styles, gladiators became archetypes, embodying virtues and vices that the audience judged, cheered, or condemned. By codifying gladiatorial combat into distinct categories, Rome transformed violence into theater. The system allowed for consistency, variety, and symbolism, ensuring that the games remained compelling year after year. The audience did not merely witness men fighting, they saw representations of strength, cunning, foreignness, and discipline locked in ritualized struggle. The creation of these standardized classes ensured that gladiatorial combat became not just bloodshed, but a carefully curated performance, a blend of martial art and social commentary. Among the most striking developments in the history of gladiatorial combat was the creation of specialized pairings that embodied tension, spectacle, and narrative. Chief among these were the matchups between the retiarius and the secutor, contests that showcased radical contrasts in equipment, fighting style, and symbolism. These confrontations were not only thrilling to watch but also deeply theatrical, presenting audiences with struggles that felt as much like drama as they did like combat. The retiarius was unique among gladiators in both appearance and tactics. Armed with a trident, a dagger, and a weighted net, he carried almost no armor beyond a protective shoulder guard. His lack of heavy equipment left him fast and agile, able to dart around the arena with relative ease. His fighting style emphasized distance, evasion, and strategy, using the net to entangle an opponent and the trident to strike from beyond the reach of a sword. This combination gave him a strange and exotic aura, setting him apart from the heavily armored archetypes that dominated the arena. To many Romans, the retiarius embodied both fascination and discomfort, admired for his daring, but ridiculed for what some saw as unmanly reliance on agility rather than brute force. His counterpart, the secutor, was created specifically to oppose him. Modeled after the murmillo but adapted for this unique duel, the secutor carried the large scutum shield and gladius sword, relying on endurance and pressure. His helmet, smooth and rounded with narrow eye slits, was designed to prevent the retiarius's net from catching on it. Unlike the open-visored helmets of other gladiators, the secutor's was almost suffocating, restricting both vision and breath. This forced him to fight aggressively, seeking to close the distance quickly before exhaustion overcame him. The secutor was a figure of relentless pursuit, his very name meaning chaser. The pairing between these two types created one of the most dramatic spectacles in gladiatorial tradition. The retiarius relied on speed, deception, and distance, circling his opponent and seeking the perfect moment to cast his net or thrust with his trident. The secutor pressed forward with methodical determination, shield raised, sword ready, attempting to trap his agile foe against the walls of the arena. The fight was a dance of predator and prey, but with the roles constantly shifting. The retiarius, seemingly the hunter with his net, might suddenly become the hunted as the secutor closed in. The uncertainty of who would triumph captivated audiences, making this pairing one of the most iconic of all gladiatorial duels. Other specialized categories further enriched the diversity of the arena. The hoplomachus, drawing on the legacy of Greek hoplites, carried a spear for thrusting attacks, backed by a short sword for close combat. His small, round shield demanded skillful footwork and constant movement. He was often matched against the murmillo, his long-range weapon countered by the murmillo's heavy shield and sword. This contest played on contrasts between reach and resilience, spear thrusts against steady blocks, the agile hoplomachus seeking to wear down the stronger but slower murmillo. The dimachus was another distinctive type, armed with two swords. Fighting without a shield, he relied on offense and speed, launching a barrage of attacks from both hands. His style was dramatic and unpredictable, designed to thrill the crowd with its daring. Yet his lack of protection made him vulnerable, ensuring that his combats were high risk and high drama. The dimachus represented the spectacle of unrestrained aggression, his dual blades flashing in rapid succession as he sought to overwhelm opponents before they could counter. Mounted gladiators, known as equites, added further variety. Beginning their contests on horseback, they wielded lances for initial charges before dismounting to continue with swords. Their helmets bore wide brims and their tunics were lighter than the armor of other types, making them visually distinct. Though less common than other categories, equites offered audiences the novelty of mounted combat, a reminder of Rome's cavalry traditions and its encounters with enemies who fought from horseback. The esidarius recreated the chariot warfare of Celtic tribes. Driving into the arena with speed, these gladiators astonished Roman audiences with displays of maneuvering and rapid strikes. Once dismounted, they fought with swords, continuing the battle on foot. The presence of chariots in the arena evoked Rome's conquests in Britain and Gaul, turning the memory of foreign warfare into staged performance. These specialized categories ensured that gladiatorial combat was never monotonous. The contrast of armor, weapons, and tactics created endless combinations of matchups, each offering different tensions and narratives. audiences came to anticipate not only the courage of the fighters but also the dramatic interplay of styles. Will the heavy shield outlast the nimble spear? Will the net entangle the sword? Will speed overcome strength? These questions made every fight a story, every pairing a miniature drama unfolding before thousands of eager eyes. Beyond entertainment, the variety of gladiatorial types carried symbolic meaning. Each style represented not only a tactical choice, but also a cultural image. The retiarius symbolized risk and cunning, the secutor persistence and discipline, the hoplomachus the legacy of Greek warfare, and the esidarius the exoticism of Celtic tribes. To witness these duels was to see Rome's world reflected back in miniature, with its enemies, traditions, and values transformed into spectacle. The specialization of gladiatorial categories thus elevated the games into a form of theatre, where combat was art as much as violence. Fighters became archetypes, embodying ideals and contrasts that resonated with the crowd. Through them, Rome dramatized its martial spirit, its conquests, and its fascination with the interplay of strength and skill. The spectacle was not simply bloodshed, it was a carefully constructed narrative where every clash of sword and shield carried meaning. The Roman passion for variety ensured that gladiatorial games constantly evolved, introducing new and exotic categories of fighters to keep audiences enthralled. While the Murmillo, Thracian, Secutor, and Retiarius formed the core of the system, organizers experimented with more unusual classes that brought novelty, spectacle, and a sense of exoticism to the arena. These specialized gladiators embodied both Rome's cultural imagination and its fascination with transforming foreign warfare into theatrical performance. One such figure was the hoplomachus, whose equipment recalled the Greek hoplite. Carrying a long spear and a small round shield, he represented a style rooted in the phalanx traditions of Greece. His helmet bore a high crest and cheek guards, marking him as distinct from the heavier Roman-style fighters. His role was often to face the Murmillo, a contest that pitted reach and agility against brute strength and shield coverage. The audience delighted in the tension of this pairing, where the long thrust of the spear sought to keep the Murmillo at bay, while the Murmillo pressed forward, waiting for a chance to strike within close quarters. The eques brought the spectacle of mounted combat into the arena, dressed in lighter armor and sometimes wearing a tunic. Rather than the heavy gear of other gladiators, the eques began his fight on horseback with a spear or lance. After charging and exchanging blows, he often dismounted to continue the fight on foot with a sword. This dual nature of combat, shifting from cavalry to infantry, made the eques a versatile and unpredictable figure. For the audience, the presence of horses and the thrill of charges within the confines of the arena offered a rare and captivating spectacle. The esidarius recreated the chariot warfare of Celtic and British tribes. Driving into the arena in a two-wheeled cart, the esidarius combined speed, maneuverability, and dramatic entrances. Chariot warfare had struck the Romans as exotic and strange when they encountered it in Britain, and in the arena it became a symbol of foreign strangeness transformed into entertainment. After dismounting, the esidarius continued with sword and shield, blending spectacle with combat. For Roman citizens, the presence of chariots evoked distant conquests and the assimilation of barbarian practices into the grandeur of Roman games. Perhaps the most visually striking of the specialized gladiators was the Dimachus, armed with two swords. Fighting without a shield, he relied entirely on offense, launching relentless attacks with both hands. His style demanded extraordinary skill, coordination, and stamina, thrilling the crowd with its speed and ferocity. The Dimachus embodied daring and risk, embodying the ideal of courage through reckless aggression. Yet his lack of protection made him vulnerable, and many Dimacheri met swift deaths. Their presence in the arena highlighted Rome's appetite for innovation and its willingness to embrace spectacle, even at the expense of fighter survival. Other rare types added further variety. The scissor wielded a unique weapon consisting of a tube-like arm guard ending in a blade, allowing him to slash with unusual techniques. The Laquarius used a lasso, attempting to ensnare his opponents in rope before striking with a dagger. The provocator fought with equipment reminiscent of early Roman soldiers, his contests often framed as symbolic duels of civic identity. Each of these unusual types offered a fresh experience for the crowd, ensuring that no two spectacles felt identical. These exotic gladiators were not only sources of novelty, but also carriers of symbolic meaning. They represented Rome's encounters with foreign cultures, its conquests, and its ability to appropriate the weapons and tactics of others. By transforming enemy styles into forms of entertainment, Rome reinforced its narrative of dominance. Every unusual gladiator reminded the audience that Rome's reach extended across the known world, capable of mastering not only distant peoples, but also their ways of fighting. For the organizers, the introduction of new types was a deliberate strategy. Audiences quickly grew accustomed to familiar pairings, and novelty was essential to sustaining enthusiasm. By presenting rare fighters, exotic equipment, or unusual tactics, editors ensured that their games stood out. A spectacle that featured dimichairi, esidari, or scissories became a topic of conversation in markets and taverns, keeping the sponsor's name alive in the memory of the people. Variety was therefore not only artistic, but also political, a way of ensuring that the games maintained their impact as instruments of influence. The presence of these exotic gladiators also highlighted the theatrical dimension of the games. Each type had its costume, its weapons, and its fighting style, turning combat into a form of performance art. The audience did not simply watch battles, they witnessed characters embodying foreignness, daring, or innovation. The arena became a stage where Rome told stories of conquest, courage, and spectacle, with each fighter playing a role in a drama as carefully orchestrated as any play performed in a theatre. In the end, the introduction of exotic gladiators reinforced the central truth of Roman spectacle. Variety was essential, but variety always served the larger narrative of Roman power. Whether through the spears of the hoplomachy, the chariots of the esidari, or the twin swords of the dimichairi, each innovation kept the games fresh, thrilling, and meaningful. The blood of these fighters sustained not only the entertainment of the crowd, but also the story Rome told about itself as the master of all peoples and all styles of war. The stage upon which gladiatorial combat unfolded was as important to the spectacle as the fighters themselves. In the earliest Roman contests, wooden platforms were erected in open spaces such as the Forum Boarium, temporary structures that could accommodate small audiences and serve the limited scale of early funeral games. These makeshift arenas were functional but fragile, dismantled after use and rebuilt when needed. Yet, as the appetite for games grew, so too did the demand for spaces capable of holding larger crowds, offering better sightlines, and enhancing the drama of the performances. By the 2nd century BC, wooden amphitheaters had begun to appear in Rome and other Italian cities. Circular or oval in shape, these structures allowed audiences to surround the combat, ensuring that no spectator was distant from the action. The very form of the amphitheater amplified the intensity of the games, enclosing the fighters within a ring that transformed their duels into theatre. Every movement, every strike, every cry reverberated within the enclosed space, magnifying the emotional impact. These arenas were still temporary, however, vulnerable to collapse or destruction, as happened during notorious accidents where poorly built wooden stands gave way under the weight of crowds. The transition to permanent stone amphitheaters marked a turning point in the history of gladiatorial games. One of the earliest known examples was the amphitheater at Pompeii, constructed around 80 BC. Built into the earth and reinforced with stone seating, it could hold up to 20,000 spectators, a staggering number for a provincial town. Its oval design, staircases and tiered seating created a template that would be replicated throughout the Roman world. The amphitheater of Pompeii revealed that gladiatorial games were no longer occasional events, but central fixtures of urban life, deserving of monumental architecture. In Rome itself, permanent structures were slower to appear. Before the Flavian dynasty, many games were still held in temporary arenas erected in the Forum or in makeshift venues. Politicians were wary of building permanent amphitheaters in the capital, fearing that such structures might concentrate too much power in the hands of those who controlled them. It was only under the emperors, beginning with Augustus and culminating in the Flavian dynasty, that Rome embraced monumental amphitheaters as symbols of imperial power. The architecture of the amphitheater was carefully designed to reflect Roman values of order and hierarchy. Seating was arranged according to social rank, with senators and equestrians occupying the best positions, while common citizens sat in higher tiers and women and slaves in the uppermost seats. This spatial organization mirrored the divisions of Roman society, reminding spectators of their place even as they shared the collective experience of the games. The amphitheater was thus both a place of unity and division, a space where the crowd came together yet remained stratified by status. Beyond seating, the architecture enhanced the spectacle itself. Subterranean chambers and corridors allowed for the preparation and movement of fighters, animals, and stage machinery. Trapdoors and lifts enabled sudden appearances, surprising audiences with dramatic reveals. The oval shape ensured that the action could be viewed from every angle, while the sloping seats focused attention on the central arena. The very design of the amphitheater transformed combat into performance, creating a stage where violence was elevated into spectacle. The construction of amphitheaters also carried political meaning. To build such a structure was to make a statement of wealth, ambition, and devotion to the people. Local magistrates and Roman governors sponsored amphitheaters in provincial towns as a way of securing loyalty and demonstrating Rome's generosity. These structures became civic landmarks, symbols of Roman culture and power, embedded in the very landscape of conquered territories. To walk into a stone amphitheater was to step into Rome itself, no matter how far one was from the capital. The amphitheater thus became more than a venue, it was an institution. Its permanence ensured that games could be staged regularly, that audiences could be accommodated safely, and that the spectacle could reach new levels of grandeur. The transition from wooden stands to stone arenas signaled the maturation of gladiatorial culture, its integration into the architecture, identity, and rhythms of Roman life. From Pompeii to Verona, from Capua to Rome, amphitheaters spread like monuments to Rome's appetite for spectacle, each one a testament to the centrality of the games in the empire's social fabric. By the time the Flavian emperors constructed the Colosseum, the amphitheater had already proven itself as the perfect stage for gladiatorial combat. It was a place where the people could gather, where hierarchy was reinforced, where politics was played out through entertainment, and where violence was transformed into ritualized performance. The stone curves of these arenas still stand today, silent reminders of a world where blood, architecture, and power converged in the most enduring institution of Roman spectacle. The Flavian amphitheater, more famously known as the Colosseum, represented the culmination of Rome's architectural ambition and its appetite for spectacle. Commissioned by Emperor Vespasian around AD 70 and completed under his son Titus in AD 80, the Colosseum was more than a building. It was a statement of imperial power, generosity, and control. Rising from the site of Nero's former Golden House, it symbolized the return of land to the people, transforming a private palace into a public monument. From the moment it opened, the Colosseum redefined what gladiatorial games could be, both in scale and in sophistication. The structure itself was a marvel of engineering. Built of travertine stone, concrete and tufa, it rose over 150 feet in height and spanned more than 600 feet in length, capable of seating between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. Its oval design ensured that every seat had a clear view of the arena, while the tiered seating reflected the social hierarchy of Rome. Senators sat closest to the action, followed by equestrians, ordinary citizens, freedmen, women, and slaves in the higher tiers. This arrangement reinforced Roman social order, even as the entire populace shared in the collective experience of the games. Beneath the arena lay the hypogeum, a complex network of tunnels, cages and chambers that enabled unprecedented levels of spectacle. Fighters and animals could be raised into the arena through trapdoors and elevators powered by pulleys and winches. This system allowed for sudden appearances, surprises, and dramatic reveals that heightened the drama. Lions might emerge from hidden platforms, gladiators might spring into view, and entire scenes could be staged with breathtaking precision. The hypogeum transformed the Colosseum into a stage not only for combat, but also for elaborate theatrical productions that blended violence with pageantry. The Colosseum also incorporated innovations to manage the comfort and safety of vast crowds. A retractable awning system, known as the velarium, shaded spectators from the sun, while efficient staircases and corridors, collectively called vomitoria, allowed tens of thousands to enter and exit the arena quickly. Water fountains and vendors provided refreshments, making the amphitheater as much a social gathering place as a venue for bloodshed. The careful design reflected not only concern for the people's enjoyment, but also the imperial goal of demonstrating Rome's ability to manage order on a massive scale. When Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in AD 80, he staged games that lasted for 100 days, a display of generosity and extravagance unmatched in scale. Thousands of gladiators fought, exotic animals were hunted and killed, and mock naval battles were staged by flooding the arena. These inaugural games announced to the world that the Colosseum was not merely a building, but the epicenter of Roman spectacle, a place where the empire's power, wealth, and reach were displayed in concentrated form. To attend these games was to witness Rome's mastery over men, beasts, and nature itself. The Colosseum was also a tool of propaganda. Its very existence proclaimed the benevolence of the emperor, who provided such entertainment free of charge to the populace. The games distracted, entertained, and unified citizens, offering them a sense of participation in the empire's grandeur. At the same time, the sheer scale of the structure reminded everyone of the emperor's authority and the might of Rome. The amphitheater was both gift and warning, a place where generosity and power converged, where the emperor's presence loomed over the fates of fighters and audiences alike. Within its walls, the diversity of Roman spectacle reached its peak. Gladiatorial duels, beast hunts, executions, and staged mythological dramas unfolded on a scale previously unimaginable. The Colosseum could transform from a battlefield to a hunting ground, from a site of executions to a stage for elaborate reenactments of legendary tales. Its flexibility ensured that it remained at the heart of Roman entertainment for centuries, capable of adapting to the shifting tastes and ambitions of successive emperors. Even today, the ruins of the Colosseum testify to the ambition that built it. Its massive arches, weathered stones, and silent corridors evoke the roar of crowds and the cries of fighters long gone. For the Romans, it was the beating heart of their culture of spectacle, a place where violence, architecture, and power converged to create experiences that etched themselves into memory. For modern observers, it stands as a reminder of the extraordinary scale of Rome's ability to merge engineering with entertainment, turning blood into a performance that shaped the identity of an empire. The venationes, or wild beast hunts, introduced an entirely new dimension to the Roman games, blending spectacle, exoticism, and brutality in ways that fascinated audiences and reinforced Rome's image as master of the natural world. These events brought animals from across the vast reaches of the empire into the arena, transforming the amphitheater into a stage for displays of hunting, combat, and slaughter. For the Roman people, the sight of lions, leopards, elephants, and bears was both astonishing and terrifying, a reminder of the empire's far-flung conquests and the power required to capture and control such creatures. The origins of the venaciones can be traced to the 2nd century BC, when animals began to appear in funeral games as part of the spectacle. At first, they were novelties, displayed to impress audiences with their strangeness. Over time, however, the hunts themselves became central attractions, featuring professional hunters known as venatores or bestiarii. Unlike gladiators who fought one another, these men specialized in confronting wild animals. Armed with spears, nets, and sometimes swords, they faced predators that had been transported thousands of miles to meet their end in Roman arenas. The logistics of staging venaciones were staggering. Animals were captured in Africa, Asia, and Europe, then transported overland and by sea to Rome. Lions came from Numidia, leopards from Anatolia, elephants from India and North Africa, crocodiles from Egypt, and bears from the forests of Gaul. The trade in exotic beasts became a massive industry involving hunters, trappers, transporters, and trainers. The survival of animals during the long journeys was uncertain, yet enough arrived in Rome to fill the arenas with staggering variety. The sheer presence of these creatures reminded audiences of Rome's global reach and its ability to subdue even nature's fiercest representatives. The hunts themselves were carefully staged to maximize drama. Sometimes, single hunters faced dangerous predators in duels of man against beast. At other times, groups of hunters worked together to corner and kill animals. Spectacles might involve hundreds of animals released into the arena at once, producing chaos as hunters fought for their lives amid snarling lions and charging bulls. Exotic creatures that Romans had only heard of in stories suddenly appeared before their eyes, transforming myth into bloody reality. Venaciones also included theatrical elements. Animals were sometimes costumed or painted, and scenes were staged to resemble mythological stories. A bull might represent the Minotaur, a lion the Nemean beast slain by Hercules. These reenactments merged hunting with drama, blurring the line between ritualized entertainment and theatrical performance. In some cases, condemned criminals were forced to play roles in these spectacles, cast as characters in myth who were devoured or torn apart by the animals. Their deaths provided both punishment and performance, reinforcing the dual function of the arena as a place of justice and entertainment. The sheer scale of some venaciones astounded contemporaries. Julius Caesar famously staged events in which hundreds of lions and other exotic animals were slaughtered, while Pompey displayed elephants in his spectacles, stunning the audience with their size and strength. Under the emperors, these events became even more elaborate. Titus's inaugural games in the Colosseum included thousands of animals killed over the course of weeks. Trajan surpassed even this, staging venaciones in which thousands of beasts and hunters perished, turning the arena into a vast theater of death. For Roman audiences, the venaciones symbolized far more than entertainment. They were expressions of Rome's dominion over the natural world, proof that no creature, however powerful, could resist the reach of the empire. To see a lion from Africa slain in the Colosseum was to see Rome conquer not only nations, but nature itself. The spectacle reinforced imperial propaganda, portraying the emperor as the provider of marvels and the guarantor of order against chaos. Every hunt, every kill was a dramatization of Rome's ability to impose control on a world that seemed otherwise wild and uncontrollable. Yet there was also wonder amid the bloodshed. Many spectators had never seen such animals before, and the chance to glimpse elephants, giraffes, or ostriches was thrilling. The amphitheater became a kind of living museum, presenting the diversity of Rome's empire in tangible form. Even as animals were slain, their presence inspired awe, a reminder of the empire's vastness and the marvels it encompassed. The venationes thus combined brutality with education, wonder with horror, reinforcing both the beauty and the savagery of the Roman spectacle. The addition of animal hunts to the games ensured that the amphitheater was never monotonous. Gladiatorial duels remained central, but the venationes added a new layer of variety, appealing to different emotions and imaginations. Together, man against man and man against beast created a spectrum of entertainment that kept audiences engaged and emperors popular. The amphitheater had become not just a stage for combat, but a theater of the empire itself, where Rome displayed its mastery over enemies, nature, and death. The naumachii, or mock naval battles, represented one of the most extravagant and audacious spectacles ever staged by the Romans. These events transformed arenas, lakes, or specially constructed basins into watery theaters where ships clashed, crews fought, and entire fleets reenacted battles from history or myth. For Roman audiences, the naumachii combined the thrill of war with the marvel of engineering, offering a spectacle so immense that it seemed to defy the limits of possibility. The origins of the naumachii stretched back to the late Republic. Julius Caesar was among the first to stage such an event, creating a vast artificial lake near the Tiber in 46 BC to celebrate his quadruple triumph. He filled it with ships and combatants, forcing thousands of captives to fight to the death in an imitation of a great sea battle. This set the tone for future naumachii, events that were rare, costly, and extraordinary, reserved for moments when leaders wished to display unparalleled wealth and power. Augustus expanded upon Caesar's example, constructing a permanent basin, the Stagnum Augusti, fed by an aqueduct, where he staged a naumachia in 2 BC involving 30 ships and thousands of men. This scale was staggering, requiring not only the building of the basin, but also the gathering of combatants, often drawn from prisoners of war or condemned criminals. The participants were forced to fight with real weapons, turning the spectacle into a staged massacre. Yet the drama of naval combat, with its crashing ships and surging waters, captivated audiences in ways no ordinary gladiatorial duel could match. The Colosseum itself was designed to accommodate naumachii in its earliest decades. Its arena could be flooded with water, allowing smaller-scale naval contests to be staged. Ingenious hydraulic systems enabled the rapid filling and draining of the arena floor, transforming the space from sand-covered battlefield to shimmering basin. While full-scale naval battles were too vast for the Colosseum's confines, mock encounters and demonstrations of ships maneuvering enthralled audiences. Watching warships glide across the same space where gladiators fought underscored the flexibility of the amphitheater and the ambition of Roman spectacle. These events were often tied to themes of mythology or historical memory. Battles might reenact famous naval encounters, such as the Greek victory at Salamis, or dramatize legendary conflicts involving sea monsters or divine interventions. The blending of history, myth, and theater elevated the naumachii beyond simple entertainment, transforming them into narratives that reinforced Rome's place as heir to both Greek tradition and divine favor. Each staged sea battle was not only a performance but also a retelling of Rome's supremacy, framed as part of a larger cosmic or historical order. The logistics of staging a naumachia were immense. Ships had to be built or repurposed, combatants armed and trained, and enormous quantities of water diverted or contained. The cost was astronomical, and only emperors or the wealthiest individuals could hope to sponsor such events. This exclusivity added to their prestige. A naumachia was not a common amusement, but a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle that bound the memory of the event to the name of its sponsor. For emperors, it was a means of displaying generosity, power, and control over resources so vast that they seemed almost divine. The scale could be astonishing. Under Claudius, a naumachia staged on Lake Fucinus involved entire fleets and tens of thousands of combatants, creating a spectacle that blurred the line between war and theatre. Participants fought desperately, aware that defeat often meant death, while audiences watched from safe vantage points, marveling at the chaos. The event demonstrated not only the emperor's ability to command men and ships, but also his capacity to bend nature itself to the will of Rome. For the audience, the naumachia offered a unique form of spectacle that no gladiatorial duel or beast hunt could match. The clash of ships, the cries of combatants, the spray of water, and the grandeur of entire fleets battling before their eyes created a sense of awe and wonder. These events carried a scale that evoked empire itself, vast, complex, and unstoppable. To witness a naumachia was to see Rome's power dramatized not only over men and animals, but over the very elements of water and fire. Yet, because of their immense cost and difficulty, naumachia remained rare. They were staged only on special occasions, imperial inaugurations, great triumphs, or monumental dedications. Their rarity enhanced their impact, ensuring that those who witnessed them carried the memory for a lifetime. The grandeur of a naumachia could not be rivaled, cementing it as the pinnacle of Roman spectacle. In the end, the naumachia represented the extreme edge of Rome's appetite for entertainment, where theatre, engineering, and death converged on a colossal scale. They demonstrated not only the resources of the empire, but also its philosophy, that no boundary of nature, of cost, of morality was too great when weighed against the value of spectacle. Executions in the Roman arena were not merely acts of punishment, they were carefully staged spectacles that blended justice, deterrence, and theatre. Known as noxi events, these executions involved criminals, prisoners of war, deserters, and those condemned for treason or heinous crimes. While gladiatorial duels and beast hunts stirred awe and excitement, the executions served another purpose: to remind spectators of the consequences of defying Roman law and order. In this way, the arena functioned not only as a place of entertainment, but also as a stage for moral instruction and social control. The condemned were often killed in ways designed to shock and impress. Some were forced to fight wild animals with little or no chance of survival, armed only with minimal weapons or sometimes bare hands. These confrontations rarely ended in victory. They were meant to demonstrate helplessness before the power of the empire. Others were executed in more elaborate fashions, subjected to burning, crucifixion, or being torn apart by beasts while bound and defenseless. The brutality was not random, it was deliberate, meant to imprint fear on the minds of those who watched. Theatricality frequently shaped these executions. Romans loved to weave mythological themes into the punishments, transforming death into performance. A man might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be mauled by wild animals while playing a lyre, echoing the mythical musician torn apart by beasts. Another might be cast as Icarus, hurled from a high platform to his death. Hercules, Prometheus, and other figures whose myths involved suffering were often reenacted, with the condemned taking on the roles and enduring real agony. In this way, punishment became allegory, entertainment, and moral lesson all at once. These spectacles were also tied to the concept of damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. Introduced in the late Republic and codified under the Empire, this form of execution became a staple of midday shows, filling the hours between morning gladiatorial contests and afternoon duels. While the morning and evening programs offered skill, suspense, and glory, the midday executions presented raw horror. The pacing of the games thus ensured variety, excitement, terror, and admiration woven into a single day of spectacle. The condemned themselves represented the enemies of Roman order. Criminals were punished publicly to deter wrongdoing, while prisoners of war symbolized conquered peoples humiliated before the crowd. Rebels and traitors were dispatched to demonstrate the futility of resisting Rome. By making these deaths public, the state turned justice into communal affirmation. The people saw law upheld, order restored, and Rome's enemies destroyed. Each execution was thus a performance of Roman power, reinforcing authority through spectacle. The audience's reaction to these events was complex. Some watched with horror, others with fascination, and still others with indifference. For many, the executions were part of the rhythm of the games, a moment of grim reality before the return of more thrilling contests. Philosophers and moralists sometimes criticized the cruelty, arguing that such spectacles corrupted the spirit, but the vast majority of Romans accepted them as natural extensions of law and entertainment. The blending of punishment with performance reflected the Roman view that public life, justice, and spectacle were inseparable. The staging of executions also required careful organization. Animals had to be prepared, props arranged, and condemned individuals costumed or positioned for maximum effect. Sometimes elaborate sets were constructed to transform the arena into mythological landscapes, forests, caves, or mountains, where the condemned played out their final roles. These productions blurred the line between theatre and punishment, ensuring that even death served the cause of spectacle. In many ways, the executions in the arena encapsulated the essence of Roman culture, pragmatic, theatrical, and unflinching in its use of violence. Justice was not hidden behind prison walls, it was displayed before tens of thousands, turned into shared experience. The condemned were not simply killed, they were transformed into actors in a drama that affirmed the values of Rome. By weaving death into myth and punishment into theatre, the Romans ensured that even the darkest aspects of their society served the greater narrative of order, authority, and power. The Roman audience was as central to the games as the gladiators, beasts, or condemned. Without the crowd, the amphitheater was nothing but stone and sand. With it, the space came alive as a theater of collective emotion. Spectators filled the tiers from the lowest seats near the arena floor to the highest benches under the open sky, each person both participant and witness in a spectacle that merged entertainment, ritual, and politics. Their voices, gestures, and judgments shaped the course of events, giving them a role that was both active and symbolic. From the moment the games began, the atmosphere was electric. Trumpets blared, processions entered, and the crowd roared in anticipation. Senators and equestrians claimed their privileged seats, while common citizens gathered in the higher tiers, their numbers vast enough to make their collective voice a force that could not be ignored. The presence of the emperor or local magistrate heightened the sense of drama, as all eyes turned to the sponsor whose generosity made the games possible. For the spectators, attendance was more than amusement. It was a communal ritual, a reaffirmation of their identity as Romans bound together by spectacle. The audience's role extended beyond passive observation. They judged the courage of gladiators, the skill of hunters, and even the fates of the defeated. When a fighter lay on the ground, begging for mercy, the crowd's cries of "live" or "kill" echoed through the arena. Though the final decision rested with the editor or emperor, the audience's opinion often carried decisive weight. Their approval or disapproval could sway outcomes, turning spectators into arbiters of life and death. This power, however symbolic, gave the people a sense of participation in justice and spectacle alike. The emotions of the crowd were intense and varied. They cheered for bravery, booed cowardice, and expressed delight at skillful strikes or dramatic reversals. The roar of 50,000 voices could lift a gladiator into fame or condemn him to oblivion. Victors basked in the applause, their names remembered and repeated, while those who disappointed the crowd suffered humiliation even before they faced death. For the spectators, the games offered not only entertainment but also catharsis, a release of collective passion through shared experience. The rhythm of the day was designed with the audience in mind. Morning events often featured beast hunts and executions, shocking and horrifying, while the afternoon brought the more admired gladiatorial duels. Between events, music, food, and conversation filled the intervals, turning the games into social gatherings as much as spectacles. Vendors sold refreshments, friends and families conversed, and political discussions mingled with the roar of the crowd. The amphitheater was not only a place of spectacle but also of community, where Romans from every class gathered under a single sky. Audience participation also extended into spectacle itself. Spectators sometimes showered victors with gifts or demanded encores of particularly dramatic fights. They praised the generosity of the editor or jeered his stinginess if the games seemed lacking in scale or novelty. Their reactions were carefully noted by politicians and emperors, who understood that the mood of the crowd could shift into unrest if displeased. The cry of a discontented people in the Colosseum was no trivial matter. It carried the potential to ripple through the city as a warning to those in power. As the practice of gladiatorial games spread beyond their Etruscan roots and the first Roman experiment in the Forum Boarium, their scale and intensity expanded with remarkable speed. What began with 3 pairs of fighters in honor of a single nobleman soon grew into spectacles involving dozens of combatants, staged over multiple days, and attracting audiences from across the city. The appetite of the Roman people for such contests became evident almost immediately, and with each passing decade, the games became more deeply woven into the fabric of civic life. By the early 2nd century BC, the expectation that prominent funerals would include gladiatorial combat had become entrenched. Families competed to outdo one another, staging ever larger and more elaborate events. A modest display of a few pairs of fighters no longer impressed citizens. The measure of a family's devotion and influence was the number of combatants it could provide, and the scale of the spectacle it could orchestrate. What had once been rare became frequent, and what had once been solemn ritual began to transform into anticipated entertainment. The public's enthusiasm grew with each contest. For the masses of Rome, citizens whose lives were often marked by hardship, labor, and political exclusion, the games offered a space of collective emotion and shared identity. In the arena, distinctions between patrician and plebeian blurred as both classes shouted encouragement, expressed outrage, and invested themselves in the fate of the fighters. Here, in the amphitheater or temporary wooden structures erected in forums, the Roman populace experienced a sense of unity. This collective experience became a powerful force, and politicians quickly learned to exploit it. The rapid expansion of gladiatorial games also altered the role of the fighters themselves. No longer limited to captives or criminals facing certain death, the contests began to feature individuals trained for the purpose of combat. The shift was subtle at first, as families sought to ensure that their games displayed skill and drama rather than clumsy slaughter. Over time, however, the emergence of professional gladiators gave the contests a new dimension. Fighters now entered the arena not only as sacrifices but also as performers, embodying martial skill and theatrical courage. The diversity of combat grew as well. Instead of uniform duels, games began to feature opponents with contrasting weapons, armor, and tactics. One fighter might be heavily armored, carrying a large shield and short sword, while another appeared with lighter gear and greater mobility. These contrasts created dramatic tension, ensuring that each fight offered novelty and unpredictability. Variety became a hallmark of the games, foreshadowing the carefully structured gladiatorial categories that would later dominate Roman arenas. At the same time, the organization of the games became more sophisticated. Sponsors employed overseers, trainers, and logistical staff to manage the fighters and ensure that the contests unfolded smoothly. Temporary arenas were equipped with seating, barriers, and designated areas for different classes of spectators. The events themselves followed ritualized sequences, beginning with processions, introductions, and salutes before the combat commenced. These refinements elevated the games from spontaneous displays of violence into structured spectacles with clear beginnings, climaxes, and conclusions. The psychological impact of these early spectacles should not be underestimated. Citizens who witnessed the contests were enthralled by the courage of fighters who faced death with resolve, by the drama of uncertain outcomes, and by the sense of participating in a moment larger than themselves. The games became conversations across the city, their details repeated in markets, taverns, and homes. To attend and discuss them was to be part of Rome's cultural life, to share in the collective memory of blood and valor. The growing popularity of gladiatorial games also began to reshape the expectations of Roman politics. Ambitious men realized that to secure favor, they must provide not only policies or promises, but also entertainment on a grand scale. The crowd rewarded those who gave generously with loyalty, and punished those who offered meager or uninspired games with mockery and disdain. The fate of political careers became increasingly tied to the arena, and gladiatorial combat moved from funerary duty into the realm of civic necessity. What had begun as sacred ritual was now fully transformed into a cultural institution. By the 2nd century BC, gladiatorial contests had become fixtures of Roman public life, growing in scale, frequency, and complexity. They were no longer marginal or occasional events, but essential expressions of Roman identity, embodying the values of courage, endurance, and martial skill, while simultaneously serving as instruments of political power and popular control. The figure of the editor emerged as one of the most important roles in the developing tradition of gladiatorial games. The term referred to the sponsor of the spectacle, the person who bore the responsibility for organizing, financing, and presenting the contests. In the earliest days, the editor was usually a family member of the deceased, fulfilling the duty of honoring the dead. But as the games expanded in scope and significance, the role shifted into a position of immense political and social weight. The editor was no longer simply a mourner. He became a public benefactor, a politician, and at times a manipulator of the masses. The duties of an editor extended across every detail of the games. He determined how many fighters would be engaged, which types of combat would be presented, how long the games would last, and what kind of equipment and setting would be provided. He also had to oversee the acquisition and training of gladiators, either by purchasing them from private owners or by hiring them from a lanista, a professional trainer and dealer. Every choice reflected upon his reputation. A poorly equipped or disorganized spectacle could ruin the credibility of the sponsor, while a lavish and thrilling series of combats could immortalize his name in the memory of citizens. The financial demands of this role were staggering. To supply fighters, armor, weapons, and logistical support for even a single day of contests often required sums equivalent to years of income for a moderately wealthy Roman. Larger spectacles could bankrupt families entirely. Many editors mortgaged their estates, borrowed heavily, or drew on the wealth of their allies in order to stage games that would eclipse those of their rivals. In this way, the gladiatorial system fed on ambition and rivalry, driving men to sacrifice fortune in the hope of gaining influence. Yet the potential rewards were just as great. A successful editor could capture the admiration of thousands, turning popular gratitude into political capital. In a society where public opinion shaped careers, the ability to please the masses with grand entertainment was invaluable. The games offered a form of direct communication between sponsor and citizen, bypassing the complexities of political assemblies or senatorial debate. A man who staged magnificent contests demonstrated not only his wealth, but also his generosity, courage, and devotion to tradition. These qualities could propel him to higher office and strengthen his position in the hierarchy of the Republic. The editor also controlled the narrative of the games. He could decide whether to highlight the courage of Rome's military traditions, to showcase exotic fighters from conquered territories, or to emphasize the values of discipline and endurance. By carefully selecting matchups, costumes, and rituals, the editor shaped the way the games were remembered. This power extended into symbolism. A particular pairing of fighters might evoke memories of recent military victories, reinforcing Rome's identity as a conquering power. In this sense, the editor wielded culture as well as spectacle, crafting messages that resonated with the audience beyond the arena. The risks, however, were immense. Failure to deliver adequate entertainment could lead to public scorn. Citizens, once accustomed to increasingly elaborate displays, were quick to express disappointment. An editor who staged meager games risked ridicule in the marketplace, damaging his reputation and undermining his political ambitions. The fickle nature of the crowd added to the danger. What might satisfy one year could be dismissed as inadequate the next, forcing editors into an endless cycle of escalation. The result was a culture where extravagance became the norm, and moderation was interpreted as weakness. Despite these risks, the institution of the editor became a cornerstone of Roman public life. It tied the fates of individuals to the spectacle of combat, linking personal ambition to the blood spilled in the arena. The games were no longer simply about honoring the dead or entertaining the crowd. They had become instruments of power, controlled and directed by those willing to bear the cost. The editor embodied this transformation, standing as both benefactor and gambler, staking his fortune and reputation on the unpredictable drama of gladiatorial combat. In the figure of the editor, one can see the merging of sacred tradition, political calculation, and popular entertainment. He was at once priest and politician, financier and impresario, judge and showman. Through his decisions, the games were shaped into a mirror of Roman society, reflecting its values of honor, courage, and discipline, while also exposing its hunger for spectacle and its capacity for cruelty. It was under the guidance of the editor that the games would continue to grow, expanding in size, complexity, and significance until they became inseparable from the identity of Rome itself. The rise of the Lanistae marked a crucial stage in the evolution of gladiatorial games, transforming the contests from occasional displays into a structured and enduring institution. The Lanista was the professional trainer, organizer, and dealer of gladiators, a figure both essential and despised within Roman society. While editors bore the glory of sponsoring spectacles, it was the Lanista who provided the fighters, ensured their readiness, and managed the complex logistics behind each performance. Without the Lanista, the editor's vision could not be realized. The Lanista operated gladiatorial schools known as ludi, where fighters were housed, trained, and disciplined. These establishments resembled military barracks with strict routines, harsh discipline, and constant preparation. Fighters lived under the watchful eyes of trainers and guards, their lives reduced to cycles of exercise, instruction, and combat drills. The schools were both prisons and academies of violence, designed to transform captives, slaves, and criminals into skilled performers capable of thrilling audiences with displays of courage and martial skill. The methods of training reflected the military roots of gladiatorial combat. Fighters were drilled relentlessly in weapon handling, footwork, and tactical maneuvering. Wooden swords and wicker shields were used in the early stages to reduce injury, while sparring partners and trainers pushed recruits to their limits. Endurance was prized, as games could last for hours and demand repeated displays of stamina. The Lanista employed experienced veterans, often retired gladiators themselves, to pass on practical knowledge of combat and survival. These men, scarred from years in the arena, embodied the hard lessons of their craft and ensured that new fighters absorbed them. The Lannister's business model was rooted in both risk and profit. He purchased slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals at low cost and invested in their training. If a fighter survived long enough to become skilled, his value increased dramatically. Editors were willing to pay high fees for proven gladiators who could guarantee dramatic contests. The Lannister thus balanced losses from deaths against gains from successful performers, treating human lives as assets in a carefully calculated economy of blood. Some gladiators were rented for specific games, while others were sold outright to wealthy families seeking to maintain their own private stables of fighters. Despite their importance, Lannister carried a stigma in Roman society. They were viewed as tainted by their trade, associated with blood, death, and the corruption of free men into instruments of spectacle. To deal in human suffering was seen as dishonorable, and Lannister were often excluded from respectable circles. Yet this disdain did not diminish their power. They commanded wealth, maintained networks across the empire, and held influence over editors desperate to secure fighters for their games. The paradox of contempt and dependence defined the Lannisters' role. Despised publicly but courted privately, condemned socially but indispensable practically. The fighters themselves came from diverse backgrounds. Many were enslaved foreigners captured during Rome's constant wars, their bodies repurposed for entertainment. Others were criminals condemned to the arena, marked for death, but trained to prolong their usefulness. Over time, however, a surprising category emerged: free men who volunteered to become gladiators. These individuals signed contracts with Lannister, binding themselves to service in exchange for pay, housing, and the chance at fame. Though stigmatized, some saw the arena as an escape from poverty or a path to honor through the admiration of the crowd. Their presence complicated the social image of gladiators, blurring the line between victim and performer. The ludi themselves became institutions of reputation. Capua, in particular, gained renown for its gladiatorial schools, producing fighters whose skill and courage were celebrated across Rome. These establishments developed specialized training regimes, focusing on different fighting styles, weapons, and tactics. A gladiator trained in Capua, or another famous ludus, carried the prestige of his school with him into the arena, much like a soldier identified with a renowned legion. The fame of certain schools grew so great that emperors themselves would one day sponsor state-run ludi to ensure control of the trade. The rise of the Lannister and their schools also had broader cultural consequences. By institutionalizing gladiatorial training, they ensured that the games could expand in scale indefinitely, no longer dependent on the chance capture of prisoners or the supply of condemned criminals. Editors could rely on a steady flow of trained fighters ready for performance. This professionalization turned gladiatorial combat into a self-sustaining industry, one that employed craftsmen, armorers, doctors, and entertainers alongside the fighters themselves. The arena became not just a place of death, but the center of a vast economic network. In this way, the Lannister represented the hidden machinery of Roman spectacle. While the editor basked in the cheers of the crowd, it was the Lannister who made those cheers possible. His schools forged men into instruments of drama, his contracts fueled the trade in human bodies, and his harsh discipline created the foundation of the gladiatorial system. He was at once a symbol of Rome's cruelty and its pragmatism, embodying the paradox at the heart of the games, that death could be managed, commodified, and sold for profit. Life inside the gladiatorial school was defined by training, discipline, and the constant shadow of death. From the moment a recruit entered the ludus, whether as a captive, a condemned criminal, or a volunteer, his existence was reshaped into that of a fighter. The lanista and his trainers understood that survival in the arena depended not on brute strength alone, but on conditioning, skill, and mental readiness. Thus, the daily routine of a gladiator was rigorous and unrelenting, designed to forge bodies and minds capable of enduring the most demanding contests. The foundation of training lay in physical conditioning. Gladiators were drilled in strength, endurance, and agility with exercises that mirrored both military training and athletic preparation. Wooden poles planted in the training yards served as sparring dummies against which fighters practiced strikes, thrusts, and defensive maneuvers for hours at a time. Weighted wooden swords, heavier than real weapons, built muscle and trained the body for the lighter feel of true steel in combat. Running, wrestling, and repetitive drills kept gladiators fit, while strict regimens of diet and rest ensured that their bodies could withstand the punishing demands of combat. Diet played a surprisingly important role in this preparation. Far from starving, gladiators were fed a carefully managed diet designed to build mass and sustain energy. Archaeological evidence, including bone analysis from gladiatorial cemeteries, shows that fighters consumed large amounts of barley, beans, and other plant-based foods. This carbohydrate-rich diet earned them the nickname hordearii, or barley men. The high-energy meals helped develop a layer of body fat that not only served as fuel, but also provided a degree of protection against shallow cuts, making the spectacle bloodier but less immediately fatal. Fighters were thus prepared to withstand injuries and prolong the drama in the arena. Weapon training was the core of gladiatorial instruction. Each recruit was assigned a particular fighting style, complete with specialized weapons and armor. A man destined to become a mormillo trained with a heavy rectangular shield and short sword, learning how to fight with patience and strength. Another, prepared as a retiarius, practiced agility and speed with his net and trident, mastering the art of entangling opponents and striking from a distance. Each class of gladiator demanded its own techniques, and trainers drilled their pupils relentlessly until movements became instinctive. Repetition was the essence of mastery, and a gladiator's survival often depended on his ability to react automatically in the chaos of combat. Romantic entanglements were a notable part of gladiator life. Graffiti from Pompeii speaks of women yearning for fighters, praising their courage and celebrating their victories. Satirists mocked noble women who abandoned their station to pursue affairs with gladiators, presenting these relationships as both scandalous and irresistible. For the gladiators themselves, such liaisons offered fleeting connections beyond the confines of the ludus, though they rarely changed their social reality. The allure of the gladiator, scarred, strong, and perpetually close to death, was a paradox that fascinated Roman society. Freedom was the ultimate dream. A gladiator who fought bravely and accumulated victories could be granted a rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized release from obligation. For many, this was the pinnacle of their careers, a chance to leave the ludus behind and live as free men. Some became trainers, passing on their hard-earned knowledge, while others faded into obscurity. A few retained fame and wealth, remembered as legends of the arena. Yet the promise of freedom was never guaranteed, and countless gladiators died before achieving it. The pursuit of this dream added poignancy to their daily lives, each training session and each fight potentially a step toward liberation or toward death. Even for those who never won freedom, the ludus offered a peculiar kind of stability. Gladiators were fed, housed, and cared for in ways many poor free citizens were not. They belonged to an institution that valued them, even if it did so as property rather than as men. This reality complicated their identity, despised as dishonorable, admired as courageous, treated as slaves, and yet in some ways more secure than Rome's impoverished masses. Their daily lives reflected the contradictions of Roman society itself, where spectacle, hierarchy, and survival intersected in strange and unsettling ways. The lives of gladiators outside the arena reveal that their existence was not defined solely by bloodshed. They were men who trained, ate, slept, loved and dreamed, living within the shadow of death, but also within a community that offered belonging and meaning. Their personal lives were shaped by confinement and stigma, but also by camaraderie, admiration, and the slim hope of freedom. In these contradictions lay the essence of their role in Roman society. Men who were both outcasts and icons, prisoners and performers, despised and adored. Gladiators lived on the edge of injury and death, and their survival depended not only on skill in the arena, but also on the medical care provided within the ludus. Far from neglecting their fighters, Lanistae invested heavily in ensuring that wounds were treated, bones were set, and bodies were restored as quickly as possible. Gladiators were valuable assets, and their preservation was both an economic necessity and a way to sustain the spectacle. The medical practices developed in gladiatorial schools reveal not only the pragmatism of Roman society, but also the surprising sophistication of Roman medicine. Each major ludus employed physicians who specialized in treating the kinds of injuries common in the arena. These doctors, often trained in Greek medical traditions, became adept at dealing with sword cuts, puncture wounds, broken bones, and dislocations. They learned through constant experience, treating fighter after fighter, refining techniques that would later influence broader Roman medical practice. The very frequency of gladiatorial injuries turned the ludus into a kind of laboratory, where physicians gained practical knowledge unmatched elsewhere. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of specialized gladiator care. Inscriptions and skeletal remains show signs of medical intervention, such as clean bone healing from fractures, suggesting the use of splints and careful treatment. Some gladiators survived repeated injuries, evidence that doctors could mend wounds well enough to return men to combat. The precision of some surgeries, including trepanations and amputations, indicates that gladiatorial doctors were not merely patching wounds, but practicing advanced procedures. The ludus was thus both a training ground for fighters and a proving ground for medicine. The treatments available included herbal remedies, poultices, and ointments to prevent infection and reduce pain. Roman medical texts describe the use of wine, vinegar, and honey as antiseptics, substances still recognized for their antimicrobial properties. Bandages and compresses were applied to close wounds, while cauterization was sometimes used to seal bleeding vessels. Bones were set with splints, and joints were manipulated to restore function. Though primitive by modern standards, these treatments were effective enough to keep fighters alive and fighting again after injuries that might otherwise have been fatal. Diet also played a role in recovery. Gladiators were fed a regimen high in carbohydrates and plant-based foods, intended not only to fuel their training, but also to speed healing. The nickname hordeari, or barley men, reflects this emphasis. Their diet likely provided the nutrients necessary to rebuild tissue and maintain stamina, even after repeated blood loss. Ashes from plants may have been mixed into drinks as a source of calcium, strengthening bones and aiding recovery. Nutrition was thus part of the medical regime, a deliberate effort to preserve the fighter's body. Medical care extended beyond the physical. Gladiators endured immense psychological strain, facing the prospect of death each time they entered the arena. Physicians and trainers played a role in maintaining morale, offering reassurance, ritual, or practical advice to help fighters cope with fear. Though the psychological sciences were not developed as in modern times, the constant attention to discipline, ritual, and camaraderie within the ludus served as a form of mental preparation and resilience building, essential for survival in both body and spirit. The reputation of gladiatorial doctors spread beyond the schools. Their skill in treating wounds made them valuable in broader Roman society, where soldiers, workers, and civilians also suffered injuries requiring similar care. Some gladiatorial physicians went on to serve in the military, their expertise in trauma medicine proving indispensable on the battlefield. In this way, the bloodshed of the arena indirectly advanced medical knowledge, producing practitioners who contributed to the wider practice of Roman healing. The paradox of gladiatorial medicine lies in its dual purpose. It was born of violence, developed to sustain men forced to fight, yet it produced knowledge and techniques that benefited society as a whole. The same practices that kept gladiators alive also aided soldiers and civilians, ensuring that lessons learned in the arena carried beyond its walls. The ludus was thus both a site of suffering and a crucible of progress, where human endurance and human ingenuity were tested in equal measure. In the end, gladiatorial medicine reveals the pragmatic side of Roman culture, willing to invest in healing not from compassion alone, but from calculation, yet in doing so, advancing knowledge that would outlast the games themselves. Every scar that healed, every bone that mended, was a testament not only to the resilience of the fighters, but also to the skill of those who tended them. Women occupied a complex and often contradictory place in the culture of the Roman games. As spectators, admirers, and sometimes even participants, their presence in the amphitheater highlighted the blurred lines between fascination, scandal, and transgression. While the arena was largely a male domain, women were never entirely absent from its world, and their involvement, whether in the audience or within the sand of the arena itself, added layers of intrigue to the spectacle. As spectators, women filled the higher tiers of the amphitheater, separated by social rank and gender according to Roman law. Yet even from these distant seats, they were vocal and passionate participants. Ancient writers remarked on their intensity, describing women who swooned over gladiators, debated their skills, and cheered with fervor equal to that of men. Satirists mocked noble women for being captivated by the sight of muscular, scarred fighters, presenting their attraction as both scandalous and irresistible. To admire gladiators was considered improper, yet the fascination endured, and graffiti across cities like Pompeii testify to women expressing devotion to their favorite fighters. This allure stemmed partly from the gladiator's paradoxical image. He was at once despised as dishonorable and admired as courageous, a man whose proximity to death lent him a dangerous magnetism. For women, to love a gladiator was to transgress social boundaries, embracing passion for one considered beneath them. Roman moralists seized on such stories as examples of decadence, using them to critique what they saw as the moral decline of elite women. Yet the persistence of these accounts suggests that the allure of gladiators was real, shaping both the gossip of aristocrats and the imagination of the masses. Beyond spectatorship, women sometimes took the extraordinary step of entering the arena as fighters themselves. Female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, were rare but not unheard of. Historical sources describe women appearing in combat during the reigns of Nero and Domitian, often as part of extravagant games designed to shock and entertain. Armed with swords, shields, or even exotic weapons, these women fought before astonished crowds, their presence turning the familiar rhythms of gladiatorial combat into something extraordinary. The participation of women as gladiators was controversial. To many Romans, it represented a shocking inversion of natural and social order. Women were expected to embody modesty and domestic virtue, not martial aggression and public spectacle. Their presence in the arena blurred gender roles, challenging norms that defined Roman identity. For this reason, emperors who staged female combats often did so to emphasize their own power to bend convention, presenting the spectacle as proof of their ability to astonish and control. The reaction of the audience mixed curiosity, admiration, and disapproval, ensuring that female gladiators remained more novelty than institution. Despite their rarity, the image of the gladiatrix captured the imagination. Reliefs and inscriptions depict women fighting, sometimes bare-chested, to heighten the sense of transgression and spectacle. These representations show that female combatants, while exceptional, were celebrated enough to be remembered in art. They embodied the Roman appetite for variety and shock, expanding the boundaries of the games while simultaneously reinforcing traditional norms by presenting women in roles meant to seem unnatural or extraordinary. Women also participated indirectly in the world of the arena through patronage and influence. Some wealthy women financed games, others supported particular fighters, and still others used their social connections to arrange favors or mercy for admired gladiators. Their involvement reveals that the games were not only spectacles for men but part of the shared fabric of Roman society, drawing in every class and gender into its orbit of fascination, scandal, and devotion. In all these roles, spectators, lovers, fighters, patrons, women were woven into the culture of the games. Their presence exposed the tensions at the heart of Roman society: admiration mixed with disdain, transgression framed as entertainment, fascination entwined with moral anxiety. The spectacle of women in the amphitheater was thus more than novelty. It was a mirror of Rome itself, a society that thrived on contradiction and found meaning in the blending of boundaries. The games, though immensely popular, were never beyond criticism. Philosophers, moralists, and later Christian writers often condemned the spectacles, arguing that they corrupted the spirit, debased morality, and glorified cruelty. Their critiques reveal an alternative perspective on Roman society, one that saw the amphitheater not as a place of communal pride, but as a theatre of vice. To read their words is to glimpse the unease that lurked beneath the roar of the crowd, the recognition that Rome's greatest spectacles also exposed its darkest impulses. Stoic philosophers were among the earliest critics. Seneca, for example, wrote with disgust about the midday executions, where criminals were slaughtered in cruel and inventive ways. He argued that such spectacles eroded compassion, teaching spectators to take pleasure in suffering rather than cultivating virtue. For Seneca, to watch a man die for entertainment was to corrupt one's own soul, dulling the capacity for empathy and self-discipline that Stoicism prized. His writings suggest that the games were not universally admired, but provoked moral unease among Rome's intellectual elite. Other critics highlighted the waste and extravagance of the spectacles. Philosophers lamented the vast sums spent on animals, stage machinery, and bloodshed, resources that could have been used for more constructive purposes. To them, the games symbolized Rome's decadence, a sign that the Republic had given way to empire not through strength, but through indulgence. They saw in the amphitheater the seeds of decline, where the pursuit of spectacle replaced the pursuit of virtue, and luxury overshadowed discipline. Christian writers advanced these critiques further, framing the games as fundamentally incompatible with their faith. To them, the arena was a place of idolatry, cruelty, and moral corruption. Tertullian denounced the games as spectacles of blood that glorified violence rather than God. Augustine later condemned them for feeding base passions, recounting stories of Christians who, once drawn into the amphitheater, became intoxicated by its violence despite their faith. For Christians, the games were not merely immoral, they were spiritual poison, distractions from salvation, and symbols of a pagan world in need of transformation. The executions of Christians in the arena intensified this opposition. Condemned believers were sometimes thrown to beasts or forced into humiliating deaths as part of the spectacle. For Christian communities, these martyrs turned the amphitheater into a site of both horror and sanctity, where the cruelty of Rome revealed itself most starkly and the faith of believers shone brightest. The games thus became not only a symbol of pagan excess, but also a crucible of Christian identity, a stage where faith triumphed even in the face of death. Yet criticism of the games was not limited to moralists and Christians. Even some Roman elites expressed concern about the effect of spectacles on the people. They feared that constant entertainment dulled civic virtue, turning citizens into passive consumers rather than active participants in the state. Juvenal's famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captured this anxiety, suggesting that the people had surrendered political power in exchange for food and entertainment. To him, the games symbolized the decline of Roman freedom, where the crowd's voice was appeased but its spirit enslaved. Despite these critiques, the games endured, their popularity overwhelming opposition. The roar of the crowd drowned out the words of philosophers, and the thrill of spectacle outweighed moral objections. Yet the persistence of criticism reveals that Rome's culture of spectacle was never universally accepted. Beneath the surface of admiration lay unease, a recognition that the blood on the sand came at a cost not only to the fighters, but to the soul of society itself. In these voices of dissent we glimpse the fragility of Rome's values. The games, for all their grandeur, were vulnerable to moral scrutiny, and in time, as Christianity rose and imperial resources dwindled, these critiques would contribute to their decline. For now, however, the amphitheater remained the beating heart of Roman life, defended by the cheers of the many, even as it was condemned by the words of the few. The decline of the Roman games was neither sudden nor simple, but the result of a gradual convergence of forces, economic burdens, shifting cultural values, and the transformative influence of Christianity. For centuries, the amphitheater had been the heart of Roman spectacle, but by the late Empire, the roar of the crowd began to fade. What had once been indispensable to Roman identity slowly lost its place until the sand of the arena fell silent, and the gladiators' swords were sheathed forever. One of the chief factors in this decline was economic strain. The empire of the 3rd and 4th centuries faced mounting pressures, invasions, civil wars, inflation, and dwindling revenues from provinces. The extravagant spectacles that emperors once staged to display their generosity became increasingly difficult to finance. The cost of maintaining gladiatorial schools, procuring exotic animals, and staging elaborate productions strained imperial treasuries already stretched by the demands of defense. Provincial towns, once eager to display loyalty through local games, struggled to fund them as resources dried up. The scale of spectacles diminished, and the lavishness that had once defined them gave way to austerity. Cultural attitudes also shifted. Philosophers had long criticized the games, but with the rise of Christianity, opposition became more organized and ideological. Christian leaders condemned the amphitheater as a place of bloodlust and moral corruption. They argued that to take pleasure in violence was to stain the soul, and they warned believers against attending. The martyrdom of Christians in the arena turned the amphitheater into a symbol of persecution, a place where faith had triumphed even as bodies were broken. As Christianity grew from a persecuted sect into the religion of the empire, its rejection of the games carried increasing weight. The conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century marked a turning point. Although gladiatorial combat did not vanish overnight, imperial support for the games weakened. Constantine is said to have banned certain types of gladiatorial contests, especially those involving condemned criminals, though enforcement was uneven. His successors continued the trend, sometimes limiting, sometimes tolerating the games, but rarely embracing them with the fervor of earlier emperors. As imperial resources were redirected toward churches and fortifications, the spectacles of the arena gradually lost their centrality. The final blow came under Christian emperors of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. In 404 AD, after a monk named Telemachus intervened in a gladiatorial fight in Rome and was killed by the crowd, Emperor Honorius is said to have banned gladiatorial combat altogether. While beast hunts and other spectacles lingered, the organized system of gladiatorial schools and contests dissolved. The Colosseum and other amphitheaters remained standing, but their sands no longer ran with the blood of men forced to kill for entertainment. Even before their abolition, the games had already begun to lose cultural resonance. Rome itself faced new priorities: the defense of borders, the management of internal crises, the rise of new religious values. The amphitheater no longer embodied the identity of the empire as it once had. What had been symbols of conquest and dominance became reminders of extravagance and cruelty, relics of a world that no longer aligned with the values of a Christianized Rome. The decline of the games did not erase their memory. Amphitheaters stood as monuments, their ruins testifying to the grandeur and excess of Rome. Stories of gladiators, beast hunts, and naval battles lived on in literature and art, shaping how later generations remembered Rome. The games became symbols not of glory but of decadence, lessons in both the magnificence and the downfall of an empire. Philosophers, Christian writers, and later historians pointed to the arena as evidence of Rome's moral corruption, using it as a cautionary tale of the dangers of indulgence and cruelty. In their decline, the games revealed their dependence on the broader structures of empire. They had thrived when Rome was wealthy, expansive, and confident, but faltered as the empire contracted and transformed. Spectacle, once the heart of Roman identity, became unsustainable in an era of scarcity and moral change. The silence of the amphitheater marked not only the end of gladiatorial combat, but also the fading of an entire cultural vision, one that had bound Rome together for centuries through the rhythm of blood, sand, and applause. The legacy of the Roman games endured long after the last gladiator fell and the last beast hunt ended. Though the amphitheaters grew silent, their memory lived on in stories, writings, and the imposing ruins that dotted the empire. The games became symbols of Rome itself, representing both its grandeur and its brutality, its genius for organization and its appetite for blood. Later centuries would look upon the arena with a mixture of awe and condemnation, reinterpreting its meaning to suit new moral, cultural, and political frameworks. For Roman writers themselves, the memory of the games was already complex. Historians such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded the spectacles with fascination, detailing the extravagance of emperors and the marvels presented in the arena. Satirists like Juvenal and moralists such as Seneca critiqued their excesses, portraying them as distractions that dulled civic virtue. These writings ensured that the games were remembered not only as entertainment, but as subjects of moral debate. To read Roman accounts is to see both pride in the scale of spectacle and unease at its implications for the soul of the people. As the empire declined and Christianity rose, the interpretation of the games shifted decisively. Christian thinkers remembered the amphitheater less as a marvel than as a place of sin and martyrdom. Tertullian and Augustine condemned the games as spectacles of cruelty that corrupted the heart, while hagiographies of martyrs celebrated those who had died in the arena for their faith. To Christians, the amphitheater became a symbol of pagan excess and moral decay, a stark contrast to the new values of compassion and spiritual discipline. The ruins of the Colosseum, once filled with cheering crowds, now stood as monuments to a fallen world. In the Middle Ages, the amphitheaters of Rome and the provinces were repurposed or neglected. Stones from the Colosseum were quarried for churches and palaces, while smaller arenas were converted into fortresses or markets. Yet their massive forms still loomed over towns and cities, reminders of a past both admired and condemned. Pilgrims and scholars who visited these ruins interpreted them through Christian lenses, seeing in them lessons about the vanity of worldly glory and the punishment of sin. The games themselves had vanished, but their memory was kept alive as cautionary tales of decadence and cruelty. The Renaissance revived interest in the classical world, and with it a new fascination for the games. Humanists studied Roman texts and ruins, reawakening curiosity about gladiators, amphitheaters, and spectacles. Artists and writers depicted scenes of combat and martyrdom, blending historical detail with moral reflection. The games were reimagined as both a testament to Rome's greatness and a warning of its downfall. This duality continued into modern times, shaping how generations viewed the amphitheater, as a marvel of architecture and organization, and as a symbol of cruelty and excess. In modern culture, the legacy of the games has taken on new forms. Historians analyze them as windows into Roman society, revealing its values, contradictions, and mechanisms of control. Novelists and filmmakers reimagine gladiators as tragic heroes, their struggles framed as tales of courage, oppression, and resistance. The Colosseum itself, restored and preserved, stands as one of the most visited monuments in the world, its weathered stones still evoking the roar of ancient crowds. The fascination endures because the games embody timeless questions. Why do humans find pleasure in violence? How does spectacle shape society? And what price is paid for entertainment? The memory of gladiators and arenas also resonates in the modern imagination as metaphors. Politicians and writers invoke bread and circuses to critique societies that pacify citizens with distractions rather than substance. Sports stadiums, with their tiered seating, roaring crowds, and celebrated athletes, are often compared to Roman amphitheaters, echoing the dynamics of fame, spectacle, and collective passion. Though the violence is gone, the structure of entertainment, shared experience, ritualized performance, and mass emotion remains strikingly familiar. The legacy of the games is therefore not confined to ruins or dusty chronicles. It lives in art, literature, politics, and even in the architecture of modern sports. The arena continues to remind us of both the heights and depths of human culture, of the capacity to build wonders and to revel in cruelty. To study the games is to confront the contradictions of Rome itself, discipline and indulgence, grandeur and brutality, power and decay. The story of the Roman games closes with a paradox as powerful as the spectacles themselves. They were at once the highest expression of Roman unity and the starkest reminder of human cruelty, a mirror that reflected both the grandeur of an empire and the darkness within its soul. For centuries, the roar of the amphitheater was the heartbeat of Roman life, its sand absorbing the blood of men and beasts alike. When the games finally faded into silence, they left behind not only ruins and memories, but also enduring questions about why humanity seeks meaning in spectacle and why violence can so easily become entertainment. At their core, the games revealed Rome's values. They celebrated courage, discipline, and endurance, qualities that Romans prized in soldiers and citizens. They reinforced hierarchy, reminding every spectator of their place through both the seating arrangements of the amphitheater and the fates decided on the arena floor. They dramatized conquest, replaying victories over enemies and the subjugation of nature itself. Every fight, every hunt, every execution was part of a larger narrative: Rome triumphant, Rome eternal, Rome unchallenged. The games were not mere diversions, they were rituals of identity, woven into the very fabric of empire. Yet the same spectacles exposed the fragility of those values. To cheer at the death of a man was to accept cruelty as pleasure, to transform suffering into theatre. The philosophers who recoiled from the bloodshed and the Christians who denounced the amphitheater recognized this contradiction, seeing in the games a corruption of the soul. Their critiques remind us that even in antiquity, not all were blinded by the glamour of spectacle. Beneath the applause lay unease, the awareness that Rome's glory carried a cost paid in human lives. The fascination of the games endures precisely because of this tension. Gladiators, condemned yet celebrated, embody the duality of human nature, despised as slaves, admired as heroes, feared as killers, desired as lovers. Their struggles resonate because they mirror the universal conflict between freedom and fate, courage and despair. The amphitheater itself, with its towering arches and weathered stones, continues to stand as a monument not only to Roman engineering, but also to the human appetite for grandeur and violence. It reminds us that civilizations are defined not only by what they build, but also by what they choose to celebrate. In the centuries since their decline, the games have been remembered, condemned, and reimagined. They serve as metaphors for corruption, cautionary tales of excess, and inspirations for art and storytelling. Modern arenas echo their form, and modern entertainments reflect their structure: ritualized contests, communal emotion, and the elevation of performers into figures larger than life. We may no longer cheer for blood, but the essence of spectacle, the hunger for drama, the power of crowds, the allure of risk, remains part of the human condition. To reflect on the Roman games is to confront uncomfortable truths. We see in them both the magnificence of human creativity and the depths of human cruelty. They remind us that entertainment has always carried moral weight, shaping societies as much as reflecting them. They teach us that power uses spectacle to bind people together, to distract, to affirm, and to control. And they caution us that fascination with violence, once unleashed, can become part of a culture's very identity. The silence of the amphitheater today is not an erasure, but an invitation. The Colosseum and its kindred ruins whisper to us across centuries, asking what we value, what we celebrate, and what we are willing to sacrifice for spectacle. In their crumbling arches, we see both the glory of Rome and its contradictions, both the brilliance of its engineering and the darkness of its appetites. The games are gone, but their lessons endure, etched not only in stone, but in the questions they leave behind. Thus ends the long story of the Roman games, a tale of sand and blood, of power and passion, of cruelty and courage. Their memory lingers because they were more than entertainment. They were reflections of what it means to be human. In them we see ourselves, our desire for spectacle, our fascination with danger, our struggle to balance morality with wonder. To study them is to hold a mirror to civilization itself, and to recognize that the amphitheater, though ancient, still echoes in the arenas of our own time.